Jeep is necessarily embracing the American dream. That's just the idea of the PR firm that is there, thinking, well, it might be good for us this year. Let's do something a little bit different. Let's embrace Americana instead of throwing it on the ground as the NFL has a habit of doing. But look, all of this is programming. Every single bit of the Super Bowl is programming. First of all, when you look at what's happening, it trains you into this vision of the world where you have two different teams, right? And it's that kind of Hegelian dialectic, the good guy, pick which team you're on, and that is a key part of politics. It's one of the reasons why they forced us into two political parties in the U.S., is to further that idea. But there's also, when you look at these ad agencies, I can imagine that there was probably a discussion at the ad agency that did the masks and vaccines. It's like, there's a big pile of money coming out of the ad council, $250 million. Maybe we can get a piece of that if we do something that's real virtue signaling, and they can sell Toyota on that. So maybe that was what was behind it. But of course, there's also that if we do something that's real virtue, Super Bowl with the satanic ritual that they call half signaling. And but I thought this was pretty amazing. This came out late last night because it was something that was dropped just before the Super Bowl. They had an interview with Joe Biden. If you saw the pictures, they're on opposite ends of a very, very big room. It was really funny to see how far away he was from the reporter because they weren't wearing masks. But of course, Joe Biden has executive orders about national parks where you will be masked. It doesn't matter. He can do an interview with somebody who is 30 feet across the room from him, let's say. But that doesn't matter in a national park. Everybody must wear masks. And I'm sure that we'll have park rangers issuing fines like TSA about that. But getting back to the news that he dropped, they aired part of the interview before the Super Bowl. Nobody was really talking about it much until later at night. One of the things he had to say was that he was going to take up the NFL on offers to use the stadiums as vaccination sites. And it's already being done, quite a few of them. And I saw that and I thought, yeah, NFL stadiums. I've done a lot of reports on NFL stadiums. The idea that taxpayers should pay tens of millions, then hundreds of millions, then billions of dollars to build these stadiums. And that was a report that I did about 7 or 8 years ago. And it was talking about how it was escalating, how in Minnesota, for example, they had done a new stadium because, see, the billionaires that we build these stadiums for and the millionaires who play in them, they don't like it if the stadium gets more than about 10 years old. They got to have a new one. And if they don't get a new one, they go shopping around. They find some other jurisdiction stupid enough to spend that kind of money to keep them there. And so it was rapidly escalating in Minnesota and other places, but it was going up exponentially. And now that we spend billions of dollars for these billionaires to provide them a place to do business, and they tell us that it's good for us because it's going to trickle down on us, right? That's the usual thing. Just like the PPP stuff, right? The PPPing down your back. And so they're telling you it's going to all trickle down because, any economic activity that the NFL does is good for the community. Not so much if you're not essential. All of those bars and restaurants and service businesses that we're allowed to have for a little while, that they're now putting out of business because, they transferred manufacturing to China a long time ago for the slave labor and the violations of copyrights and so forth. But now they're purging out the service businesses, and those service businesses just are not essential. But, football is. And quite frankly, professional sports are essential. It's part of the bread and circuses to keep you distracted, to make you feel like things are normal, even though you've got cardboard fans in the stadiums now. What's going on here? But now these magnanimous billionaires that we spent billions of dollars to build these stadiums for them, now they're going to graciously allow these stadiums to be used by the government that gave them the money so the government can jab us. Isn't that nice? See how it just goes full circle? What goes around comes around. First they pick your pocket to build these stadiums, and then they put you in the stadiums to jab you. So Biden said he expects to take up the offer from the NFL to use its 32 stadiums as mass vaccination sites during the interview that aired Sunday. I mean, that's really kind of poetic justice. I mean, if you're so distracted that you are not really understanding what's happening to the world, not just America, but to the world, if you're so preoccupied with the circus that you don't get what's going on, that's what they're going to do. They're going to round you up in those stadiums. These people will probably be pretty excited about, hey, I get to go in the stadium for free. You know that stadium that I paid for? They're going to let me go in and see what it looks like without having to buy a ticket. CBS's Norah O'Donnell had the interview, and in it, Biden said he'd receive a call from the NFL commissioner, Roger Goodell, in which the commissioner offered the 32 stadiums as potential vax sites. And he's saying, yeah, we got to do this because it's time for the schools to reopen, said Biden. That's the other thing he said in the interview. He said, roughly 20 million kids are not able to attend school this year. This is, quote, a national emergency. Well, yeah. I mean, it was a national emergency that shut the schools down, right? So get rid of the national emergency. We've had enough national. So we got to have another national emergency of not being in school to counteract and to, I guess you could say, trump the national emergency executive order from Trump. But why is it now? Why is it now a national emergency? Because we're now 333 days into this, right? But now everything has changed because there's a new sheriff in town, as they like to say. Except it's a sheriff that's, he and Vice President Harris will virtually tour. They're not actually going to go there. They're going to virtually tour it because that's the only kind of tourism that most people are going to be doing. You know, Biden is the perfect icon for the kind of society they want us to live in. Virtual tourism, the virtual president, the guy that they prop up, the weekend with Biden president, right? Not Bernie, but Biden. So they'll have a virtual tour of the vaccination site at State Farm Stadium in Arizona. This is the other thing that amazes me. I mean, I haven't watched football since I was in high school and college when I was in marching band. And it's funny to see all of these stadiums named after corporations. They get to put their name on it. We pay the bulk of the money, but they put their name on it. So they said 6 other stadiums are currently in with that. But the other part of the Super Bowl that I thought was interesting, seeing the headlines, was the Super Bowl kicked off with the Black National Anthem. I didn't know that we had a Black National Anthem. I didn't even know we had a Black nation. Silly me. I should have figured that out to see the kind of preferential treatment that Black Lives Matter gets. And, of course, what happens with the NFL. The league chose the Black National Anthem for both the opening day of the 2020 season and for the Super Bowl in order to virtue signal. And then this article from Babylon Bee. Fox News analysts declare Tampa Bay the Super Bowl winners only 4 minutes into the first quarter. And, of course, this came out before they actually won the game. Our expert analysts are now calling the game for Tampa Bay, said Chris Wallace. The game is over. May as well pack it in and go home now because we already declared the winner. But we'll continue to cover the remaining portion of this game that the Chiefs have absolutely no chance of winning. Kansas City head coach Andy Reid is furious and has called for fans to protest the, quote, rigged Super Bowl. Fans have responded by charging the press box where Fox News analysts are hiding. There they go. It's Babylon Bee. Hedge fund CIO says, I didn't realize how many people understand the extent of the Fed market manipulation. Yeah, see, they think we don't understand because they think we just watch things like the Super Bowl. And the vast majority of the people do. But there are quite a few people who understand what is going on. This is coming from Eric Peters, a different Eric Peters, not the Eric Peters of epautos.com, who, again, as soon as we get our capability to do interviews back, and we're still waiting for some equipment, one of our first people to get back on. But this is a different Eric Peters. This is a guy with One River Asset Management, and he's had some conversations with some people. He says he was talking to a PM, doesn't say which one. Says, I was looking through the Reddit chat rooms of the PN, Wall Street Bet, kind of felt surprised by the chatter. I didn't realize how many people out there understand the extent of the Fed market manipulation that occurred over the past year, ever since 2008, really. Not sure why it grabbed me. I just suppose I've been under this illusion that it's mostly people in the industry who see through what's been happening, and that the rest of the people working in random industries with real jobs haven't understood it. And Eric says, I nodded, that faith in our institutions is gradually slipping away. He said, the level of disillusion with the system may be kind of breathtaking. I just didn't appreciate how widespread it seems to be. Well, when we look at what is happening, I think people understand how the Fed has inflated things, but do they really understand how deeply and how quickly this is going, how this has been a plan for a very long time? And as he points out, the 2020 recession was 5 times the average since World War II, but it occurred in only 25% of the time. I mean, when I was looking at the massive unemployment figures, and of course, they're always underreported, misreported. When you talk about fake news, take a look at the labor statistics. They cover up for every president, and they're constantly readjusting them the next quarter. That's one of the reasons that you know that this is all a lie, that it's all fake. Every quarter, they will raise when they come out with the new numbers, they will raise the ones from the previous quarter so that it looks good. Every quarter they do that. But it occurred in 25% of the time, but it was 5 times the average since World War II. So you multiply those together, and you get like 20 times as bad, the combined rate, the velocity at which things are getting bad. In a year when 11 million people, however, think about this though, because he makes a point. Eric Peters of One River Asset Management says, in a year in which 11 million people were unemployed, we had the largest increase in personal income in 20 years. How'd that happen? Well, because the government is throwing cash at it, right? Is that a good thing? He said the CARES Act increased the deficit in 3 months by more than the past 5 recessions combined. And in 6 weeks, the Fed bought more treasuries than it did in 10 years under Bernanke and Yellen. Not that Yellen is a fiscally responsible individual. This just shows where we are right now. So more in 6 weeks. The Fed bought more treasuries in 6 weeks than it did in 10 years. Corporate borrowing, which always goes down in a recession. Remember, this recession is 5 times worse than the average recession and happened very quickly. But corporate borrowing, which always goes down in a recession, actually increased from 6 trillion to 10 trillion going into the crisis due to the Fed's free money policies. The juxtaposition, and then this is the other part of this. Look at what is happening in the U.S. This is happening in the U.S. What is happening in China? The juxtaposition of these two countries is breathtaking. Since 2018, M2 money supply in the U.S. has grown 25% more than nominal GDP. In China, it's the same as it was 3 years ago. So China hasn't borrowed anything from their future, while we've had a massive liquidity input, a massive debt bubble. But there's very little investment, mostly just transfer payments, like stimulus. And so this is where we are. This is where we are. And over the weekend, I saw people passing around what Rush Limbaugh had to say. And I don't want to criticize Rush because he's sick, but I mean, it's his, what he is saying. And at first he starts by saying, my days are numbered. Well, that's true of all of us. We just may not realize it. There's going to be a lot of people who die before Rush Limbaugh does. It could be young people who die in a car crash. Tomorrow's not promised to any of us. I had a Christian friend who was undergoing cancer treatment, and as he was driving to get treatment, a 4x8 sheet came off of a plywood sheet came off a truck in front of him and just barely missed decapitating him. It sailed, it didn't hit his car, it just sailed right over the car, but just about 6 inches lower. And I would have been killed going to get cancer treatment. And so you never know how this is going to work out for any of us. So I say this not to criticize Rush, as he is dealing with some very challenging issues. I wish him well. but I don't agree with his analysis, because he began by saying, thank you, President Trump, and he has a whole list of things that he wants to thank Trump for. He begins by saying, thank you for showing us that we don't need to be under China's thumb, economically or in any other way. Wow, that's good. I'm glad that Trump saved us from China. I'm glad that he didn't take the bait and do a lockdown as they modeled for us. I'm glad that he didn't completely destroy the middle class with that lockdown, that he didn't shower us with free money more than was proposed by the most radical Democrats the preceding year, like Bernie Sanders and AOC and Andrew Yang and so forth. That he didn't set up a communist stimulus income, very, very basic income. As a matter of fact, not enough income to live off of, but you're not going to have a job. So we'll give you some unemployment benefits. We'll throw in a little bit of stimulus here just to keep you from getting too angry. And then we'll go into massive, massive debt. And when this whole thing blows up and collapses in a giant black hole, it'll be China's fault. It'll be the virus's fault, right? And of course, they do have us eating out of their hands economically. We are under China's thumb economically. And the model of authoritarian dystopian abuse that they showed the world that has now been adapted everywhere is far worse than the economic damage. But the economic damage is going to multiply that once it kicks in. And if we have borrowed from the future to the extent we're just talking about here, more in 6 weeks than we've done in 10 years prior to that. And the fact that businesses are expanding, even though unemployment is skyrocketing, simply because the government is coming in and distorting reality. So, as Rush Limbaugh said, thank you, President Trump, for making it cool to be American again. We can always wave the flag and hug the flag and pretend that this doesn't exist. We can cheer the people at the Super Bowl and feel good about it as if we're somehow normal and just not paying any attention to the fact that the stadium is only occupied by about 25% of the people. The other 75% of the spaces are cardboard cutouts, just like President Trump. Yeah. He went on to say, further down, he said, thank you for Operation Warp Speed, Rush said to President Trump. Thank you for Operation Warp Speed and keep your promise to bring COVID to us in less than a year. You know, I'm always in favor of presidents keeping their promises. I just kind of thought it would be the promises he made to get elected, not the promises he made to somebody else at Davos or wherever it was that he stuck the knife in our back. Speaking of symbolic sock puppets, Greta Thunberg has now been exposed yet again as passing on a bunch of stuff that's been prepared for her, she and her family. This one in India, they have been pushing farmers to protest there. And I'm not saying they don't have a gripe. I don't even know what that issue is. I do know there is a political divide with this in India. And that part of what was being pushed out with this toolkit that she put out was, and it was quickly removed, but some people got it because that always happens on the internet. So she put it up, some people grabbed it, and then she took it down and then put up another version that was edited somewhat, watered down a little bit. Evidently, the other one might not have even been intended to be published because it was kind of a game plan of how they could incite people to revolt, incite them to violence. And so now there's some legal actions that are happening in India. And it's not just Greta, it's also Rihanna, the pop music star. Initial probe suggested that the toolkit that she linked to could have ties to a pro-Khalistan group. Again, this is another group that is once a separate country for the Sikhs carved out of Punjab. So this is internal politics, and there's a lot of stuff that's going on here, and that's not really the issue to get involved in Indian politics that I don't really know anything about. But what it shows is how they use these celebrities, especially Greta Thunberg, over and over again. It's been shown how she is just a sock puppet for other interests. And Rihanna, for her part, this is part of a pro-Khalistan group. This is what, they want to create an independent state. And look, I in general, I don't know what's going on there, but in general, I always support people's right to self-government. And I think the consolidation of regional power into nation states and then into a global government is the wrong direction to go. I think we need to be getting government smaller and closer to the people. See, I think even Texas is too big to be governed. There are people who want Texas to secede from the United States. I want to know how I can secede from Texas. Texas is too big. Texas has got more people in it already than the 13 colonies did when they got their independence, and it's too big to be governed. It's not representative enough. Just look at the fact that we've got a governor who has mandated masks on us now for 7 or 8 months. It's been going on. A governor that spent $250 million at the very, very beginning of this. And both sides, people who were pro-pandemic and people who were pandemic skeptics, were saying, what in the world? We've never heard of this company. It's a little tiny company in Frisco, Texas. And the CEO has got a rigged curriculum. He doesn't have a background that matches up. These people have never done anything. And he spent $250 million so he can track and trace us. What's going on with this? This is, even if you want to do track and tracing, this looks like a little bit of graft and corruption going on here. But Abbott was in on this from the very beginning, way before the mask started. That's why it wasn't a mistake to put the mask in. No, he's part of the inside group. He knew this was happening a long time beforehand to kick in $250 million. So Texas is way too big to be governed. So we need something smaller than Texas. I mean, you have corruption in Rhode Island as well. So it isn't necessarily just the size, but you have to have more representation. And this kind of corruption can happen anywhere. So as we're talking about these people who want to create a separate Khalistan, Rihanna was also caught up in this. And it turned out that she's been getting involved in Indian politics. You got to ask yourself, why is Greta Thunberg a Swede and Rihanna an entertainer in America? Why are they getting involved in this fight for Khalistan independence, for or against? Rihanna was paid $2.5 million by a PR firm with Khalistani links. So there's something to see here for all of us, not just people who are interested in India. This is the way this is rolling out globally. The ASPCA has put $20 million offshore instead of helping animals. Now, again, it's always good to know which charities are operating efficiently and which ones are really feathering their nest and lining their pockets with your contributions. But this is another indication, as we've seen this happen before with the Southern Poverty Law Center. The SPLC is not an advocate for the people that they claim to be advocates for. As a matter of fact, you had Morris Deese, who founded that. His only involvement, he supposedly positioned himself out there as somebody who is going to take on the Ku Klux Klan and shut down racism everywhere. And he did that before it became a college major for everybody. But Morris Deese's only involvement in the civil rights movement was to represent the Ku Klux Klan and to make more than the average family of four, the median income, I should say, not average, but the median family of four income was at the time that he did it. And so he defended the guys in Birmingham, Alabama, who beat people who were protesting peacefully and set fire to their bus. And I don't care what the cause is or whether you agree with it or not. I mean, the idea, and you get legal counsel, right? Anybody can get legal counsel, and he was very handsomely paid. And then he set out the rest of the civil rights movement. As a matter of fact, he went into the direct mail business and found that he could make more money doing that than he could as a lawyer. And he got back into politics when Jimmy Carter ran. He offered to do the direct mail for Jimmy Carter in exchange for the Democrat Party's mailing list. And so then he reinvented himself as somebody who was on the side of civil rights. And they've been putting massive amounts of money offshore, just like the ASPCA, who are advocating, for dogs and cats, right? And I love dogs and cats. But these people are not not advocating for dogs and cats. They're advocating for more money. Just as with another national animal charity, writes HumaneWatch.org, that is the Humane Society of the U.S., the ASPCA has a lot of corporate bloat and high executive salaries. And that's another thing that they share with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Even the people who agreed with their stated mission, whether or not they were doing it, said they're really not getting much done. And they're making an awful lot of money, and they're stashing it overseas, which is what the ASPCA is doing. Their CEO makes over $800,000 in compensation. In total, they had more than 172 people at the ASPCA earning more than $100,000 in compensation. And they also have an $18 million offshore account in the Caribbean and an additional $4 million stashed away in Europe. It's not helping any of the four-legged animals that they say they're advocating for. About 41% of their budget, as a matter of fact, is spent on corporate overhead. And when you see that happening with a charity, you need to look for another charity. Jeff Bezos is not going to be running the ASPCA, but he is going to be running our satellite business if he gets his way. You know, when he left Amazon, I mentioned it briefly. There's an article up on the New American. Their take on it is that he's not retiring. He's looking to get even more. He wants to be a modern-day railroad baron, except where the railroads are being built is in space right now. And so as they see it, he is getting involved with satellite business. It's really about his space venture, Blue Origin. And as he said from the very beginning, I think it's even more than just the satellites. You know, we have a space race that's going on between Bezos and Elon Musk, the richest African-American, the richest person in the world, who happens to be African-American, Elon Musk. And so there's this competition going on between them for satellites. That's the immediate competition. But they're really going for the high frontier. They're really going for the high ground, literally. The kind of Elysium, as I've mentioned before, that was, and Jeff Bezos talks about how that was the thing that always inspired him. He never aspired to be an online bookseller. He wanted to establish these Elysium, if you remember the movie Elysium. Well, it was patterned after an idea that's put out by Gerard K. O'Neill called High Frontiers in the 1970s, and that really captured his imagination as an engineering student, mine too. And he wants to set up factories in space, living areas in space. That's really where he is headed, to the Lagrange libration points instead of to Mars. That's where Elon Musk says he wants to go. I don't know if Musk is really going to be heading that. Maybe the Mars thing is a misdirection. Such an idealistic thing. But Bezos is a lot more practical about it. And, you know, by getting out of the Amazon thing, he's built a fortune out of that. But he's really going to be focusing on space. Both of them are going to be focusing on space. Biden, however, will be taking Trump's wall to the next level. He's not ending the wall. He's making something that is far, far worse than what President Trump proposed. You know, as President Trump was talking about putting a wall across the southern border, many people, myself included, said that's not really the right way to handle the issues. What is the problem with people coming into this country? Well, there's two problems. One is that if you bring people in rapidly enough, you can use it to alter the culture, and you can make a dependent subclass, and then you can divide those people. If they're not all part of, if you destroy the idea of a melting pot, then you have disparate groups that are not integrated with each other, that don't have a common history and so forth. And that's what they're just trying to do with everything. Obviously, you can see that in the schools, right? You can see that in the 1619 Project. They're trying to divide people whose families have been here for centuries, but they're also trying to divide us with new arrivals in sufficient numbers. And they can use that for political purposes, divide and conquer. Very simple. But when you come after Trump supporters, so that is all coming up. Let's take a look at headline news, and of course, We all talked about the Super Bowl on Sunday, but yesterday they came out with their happening well before the lockdown happened. And it was when we saw what they were doing in terms of the virtue signaling, the fact that the NFL is going to be using their stadiums for vaccinations now. And of course, it's their stadiums, but we paid for them, right? Took out big bond issues in most states. Sometimes it was at state level. Usually it was at the city level. But it got so big that a lot of states had to step in to give these billionaires billions of dollars to build the stadiums named after them. And then if you don't rebuild that within about 10 years, they move somewhere else. So they blackmail people into doing that. And I had a listener send me an email when I was talking about the fact that now these stadiums that we paid for are going to be used as mass vaccination sites. And one of the listeners said, I thought that was kind of interesting. He goes, I remember that the Taliban used football stadiums for executions. Of course, that was soccer, and I think that actually was in areas that were occupied by ISIS. But you get the idea, right? Same idea. We have Democrats demanding that Parler reveal its investors and creditors. Well, this is part of the investigation, even though we had the only person who was killed as part of this. And it's very important that we understand. And the Democrats, as part of their trial yesterday, was saying 7 people died. Now, I'd seen the figure of 5. I don't know where the 2 additional people that they're adding to this are. Maybe it's people who later died and they tested positive for Capitol riot. But I don't know where that number of 7 came from. There really was only one person who was killed, and that was Ashley Babbitt. The police officer, and we'll talk about this coming up as they're coming after Trump supporters, but the police officer who died did not die from any blunt trauma. Even CNN admits that now. He was not bludgeoned to death. He wasn't hit with a fire extinguisher that somebody threw. He died from a stroke caused by blood issues and blood clot issues. So one person was killed, and not 7, but Ashley Babbitt, who was killed, posted this and said, nothing will stop us. They can try and try and try, but the storm is here, and it is descending upon D.C. in less than 24 hours, dark to light. She was subsequently fatally shot inside the Capitol building, and of course the guy who shot her at point-blank range through a glass window. No charges against him. But the charges are against Parler, right? Except she didn't put that on Parler. She put that on Twitter. Twitter has not been removed and should not be removed. The entire platform should not be taken down. But understand that the one person who is, actually, she died as she was murdered. She wasn't a killer. But the one person who died in the violence, the other people who died, there was somebody who got trampled by the crowd, I think, and there was a couple of people had strokes and died because of the excitement or the crowd or whatever, or just a large crowd, and somebody died. I don't know what happened with these other ones, but the only person who came to a violent death was Ashley Babbitt. And this tweet was on Twitter. This is not something that was on Parler as a parlay. But I've said before, it doesn't matter if it had been on Parler. That would not be justification to take it down. And yet you have Carolyn Mahoney, a Democrat from New York, who is chair of the House Oversight Committee, is demanding now a witch hunt into the investors of Parler. It's not just enough to take down an entire platform, because people were exercising free speech, and they claimed that the information was not taken off quickly enough. No, we're going to ignore Section 230. By the way, Breitbart points out that John Sullivan, who was arrested and charged in connection with it, a left-wing activist, a lot of people looked at him and said, well, this is evidence that there were agent provocateurs on the left. Well, that's still to be adjudicated. He says he was a journalist. They'll probably accept his explanation that he was a journalist, even though he was making provocative statements. Say, we did it. Perhaps maybe egging other people on, whatever he was saying, that'll have to be looked at in a trial, presumably, but there's other people who were there who were conservative supporters of President Trump who said they were also acting as journalists. I said, no, you're not. A left-wing activist can be a journalist, but not a right-wing activist. So John Sullivan also had a Twitter account. He still has a YouTube account, and he still posts videos on there. In other words, this guy who has been an activist for, I don't know if it was BLM or Antifa, but he's been an activist for them. And he's put up a lot of videos showing violence and everything. I am banned on YouTube right now because I talk about things like vaccines or question government narratives about, you name it, elections, anything. And yet this guy is allowed to exist there. In addition, they said, according to a recent press report, the Trump Organization negotiated on behalf of the then President Donald Trump to make Parler his primary social network. But it had a condition, an ownership stake in return for joining, she added. These negotiations reportedly occurred while President Trump was still in office, which experts have warned raise legal concerns regarding anti-bribery laws. Well, I don't know about that, but I think that is really at the essence of this new investigation, wanting to know who the owners are, who the investors and creditors are. I mean, they've gone after Parler to take them down simply because they don't want a site anywhere that supports free speech, and they'll use any kinds of a justification to do that. But to go after the investor information is really trying to get information, I think, about further extending this with Trump. Parler reportedly offered Trump a 40% ownership stake, but the negotiations were ultimately derailed by the events of January the 6th, alleged Congresswoman Maloney. So we'll see if Maloney is full of baloney. She will do this investigation, though. It is a witch hunt. It is a witch hunt to go after free speech. And understand that as we look at what is happening with the National Guard there, the thousands of troops still in that small city, the concertina wire, the fences, everything that's there, the National Guard presence there in the Capitol is going to cost $483 million. $483 million. Forget about helping small businesses that you have just forced to close by edicts. No. $483 million, not a problem. Why? Because this is necessary for them to push through a domestic terror act. That's going to be the real cost of this. Not $500 million. I don't know how long they're going to leave it. But that is, I guess, where the tab is at the moment. And it will probably continue to go up because I don't think they're going to be removing these people. It is a massive tab that is happening. Senator Tom Cotton said, as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, he's not aware of any threats necessitating their continued presence in the Capital Region, and it's time to send them home. Which reminds me of the lawsuit against the TSA that was filed by an engineer, not very happy about the strip search requirements or the naked body scanners, and he'd exposed that, and he sued the TSA, and part of that suit, he was able to get document discovery. Now, when they published it on the pacer.gov site, which is where all the lawsuits are published, when they first put it up, they put up an unredacted report. And then they realized what they had done, and they put up a redacted report. And so you're able to see what they didn't want you to see, because it was very convenient. By doing it in that order, you could see, well, because people captured the first one. We did. And so you could see just what, okay, they don't want us to know this. One of the things they didn't want us to know was that as they were rolling this stuff out, and as there was a pushback here in Texas, if you recall, unanimous with the state house to say, you are not going to do this to kids. You're not going to do body searches and touches to us. You're not going to have naked body scanners. They did that unanimously. Of course, it was subsequently shut down when it went to the Senate because the then lieutenant governor, who was a former CIA guy, after he got out of CIA, they set him up in the oil industry, and he spent more than anybody else has ever spent to get elected to statewide office in Texas. And he led the opposition to that and got it shut down in the Senate. But they were concerned about that. So concerned, they said, this is going to be a no-fly zone in Texas if you don't let us put our hands on your bodies and your children and scan you and so forth. And as part of his lawsuit, he was able to determine that at that exact time, TSA internal documents said, there is no threat against airplanes or airports anywhere. No terrorist threats. Yet they still did it. And we still continued to have the TSA. So even though Tom Cotton says, well, as part of the Senate Intelligence Committee, there are no threats, doesn't mean that you're not going to have security theater, because that's what the TSA is. It's theatrical security agency. It's not transportation security, it's theatrical security. They don't provide any real security. They fail with their internal tests. They won't say exactly what the numbers are, but congressmen who've seen it have hinted that it is in the high 80s, low 90s, that they fail. And the very idea of the way this is structured, if you were to, had a lot of people who are security personnel saying, if you bunch people up, it doesn't matter where you bunch them up. It doesn't make it any safer if you bunch them up inside the building. You've now created a very vulnerable target because you created a large area of population density that can be attacked. And we've seen this abroad. We've seen churches who set up metal detectors and scanners and security at the entrance to the church. And so where do the suicide bombers go? To the bunched up people there. So none of this is about security. The National Guard is not about security any more than the theatrical security agency that we have in the airports is about security. But this is about, and it's not even about the cost. It's not even about $500 million. The true cost is going to be the cost in our liberty, the Domestic Terror Act. This is to train these people in Washington to keep them in a state of fear and loathing of all these pitchfork-wielding people that they see, the great unwashed and flyover country. So they want to keep Congress afraid of that, and they want to push this Domestic Terror Act through. Speaking of terror, we had an individual killed in a trampoline and adventure park. This is in Tennessee. Timothy Wilkes, a 20-year-old YouTube creator. I guess he's still got his channel too. He was shot when he was doing a stunt. It was kind of a skit. He and some of his friends got butcher knives, and they thought that it would be funny to film themselves, so somebody else was there filming it, to go into this trampoline adventure park. I don't really get what the gag was, and neither did a 23-year-old who was there. As they approached a group of people with their weapons out, 23-year-old David Starnes allegedly drew his gun and fired, killing Timothy Wilkes, 20 years old. The alleged shooters claimed he was unaware that it was a prank, and they acted in self-defense and in defense of the other people there. A customer who was there, this business is called Urban Air, questioned the idea of such a dangerous prank. As Breitbart points out, especially in such a populated area, he said, quote, this is like a huge kids area. And when we were in there were a ton of tiny kids, and it's just like, that would not be a great idea, especially if anyone was walking out here or something like that, she told a local news station. But I guess, if you do videos where you have knives and you threaten people, that's okay on YouTube. It's okay if you've got BLM and Antifa riots and you show that. It's just not okay to talk about false government narratives. Biden opens a major push for LGBT rights abroad, and they have LGBTIQ. They've added another letter in here. I have not figured out what that is yet. Not that I'm interested. That's right. Travis says they may not know yet. That's just the I, just in case, right? They said they're going to build international coalitions against homophobia and transphobia. And Jessica Stern, executive director of the advocacy group Outright Action International, said Maybe that's it. Maybe it's an international, because they added the I just before they do this abroad. So maybe it's LGBT International Q. She said that to have President Biden issue this very holistic presidential memorandum so early in his administration is a clear indication this is a political priority for him. Well, we know it's a political priority for him. They really talked about this more than any other issue except for the pandemic, I guess. You know, the pandemic and vaccination, they've talked about that a great deal. That's been about 17 of his executive orders. But that was when the executive orders were 30. They're now up to over 45. Think about that, over 45. I mean, the previous record for 100 days was Donald Trump of 33. And prior to that, it was, 15 or 16 for Obama, and maybe for Bush, it was only about 10 or 12 or something like that. And now he's had 45, and he's only been in for about 3 weeks, about 20 days instead of 100 days. So a lot of executive orders, and they've talked a great deal about transgender issues, even in the run-up. So much so that I started talking about the transition team and the Biden administration being a sex change team. But this is what this looks like internationally. Australia, Victoria, where you've seen the radical lockdown, the militarization of the police against people for their coronavirus regulations. Now there is an extreme left-wing conversion ban bill. This is reported by the New American. Radical conversion ban, quote unquote, passed in Australia, poses a threat to religious and medical freedom. And this is not just a bill that's been introduced. This is actually passed, and it will go into effect in 12 months. So what is it? It'll make it illegal to attempt to change or to suppress a person's unwanted sexual orientation, sexual activity, or gender identity in the state. The bill's dangerous overreach could impact, listen what it's going to impact the way parents interact with their children. It'll compromise religious freedom, and it'll even impact the practice of psychiatry and psychology. It's titled Change or Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition. And so it seeks to ban change or suppression practices directed toward a person with or without the person's consent. You understand? Even if the person says, I don't want to do this, that might imply that you're talking about some of these groups that are allowed to exist on Twitter and Facebook. The minor attracted persons, they say, well, we're attracted to children sexually, but we don't want to do anything about that. So do you want to change that before you do anything about it? Do you want some even psychiatric help? Oh, no, you can't seek that out even if you wanted to change that, right? It ultimately targets the Christian worldview of gender and sexuality, the one that I always point out. My view is not LGBT, but it is BOB, Bob. Biological, objective, and binary. Well, we could call it biblical, too. We could put 2 B's on there. Bob. It dictates the behaviors of spiritual leaders as well as medical professionals to force them to conform to the state's philosophy. That is exactly what this is. It's a state philosophy. It's a state religion. It is being imposed. And, of course, they're doing it out of compassion for groups with nothing but contempt for the individual. And this is what we see as the pattern coming after us everywhere. The idea that these progressive institutions are going to defend the rights of groups by attacking the rights of every individual. Even individuals who don't want to be a part of that group anymore. No, you can't leave. You can't talk to anybody about getting out of that group. You're in that group. You got to stay there. And the concern is, folks, that this is not, as I said before, it's not that they want you to tolerate what people do. They demand that you celebrate it. They have a lot of demands, and their demands are focused on overthrowing the free exercise of religion, overthrowing the family. And understand that the family is the fundamental building block of society. You know, if you want to know what to do about all these things that are happening right now, you know, you need to start banding together and you need to start figuring out how you are going to exist in this new normal that they're trying to shove down our throats, of the lockdown, of not being able to travel without a vaccine passport, all of this, to buy, to sell, to go to school. You better start looking at how you're going to do this, and you better start making alliances with people in your community so that you can eat, so that you can earn a living and other things. And that begins with your family. The ultimate anti-authoritarian cell, the ultimate underground resistance cell is the family, if you want to think about it from a political standpoint. It's also the institution that God created. The rest of these institutions were created by man. A parent whose 5-year-old son was insisting that he was a girl, for example, would be prevented from seeking any help, either medical, psychological, behavioral, spiritual, social, or otherwise, to assist their son in understanding and accepting that he was a boy. Anything less than an affirmation of him as a girl would be prohibited. Well, you know, those people in Australia, I don't know, they're just out there, right? Well, no, actually, that's happened here in Texas. Interviewed the father of a young boy named James. Had the website Save James, and that's what a Texas judge said. After the father and mother were divorced, the mother determined that two twins, they had 2 twin boys that were the product of in vitro fertilization, and she had determined that one of them was going to be a girl. And the judge sided with her and had a court order forbidding the father to use James's name or anybody else. You'll call him by his new girl name. And to say that by the time he's 8 years old, he would have to pay for a sex change operation for this boy. Being berated by the mother. Now that is okay for the mother to do that, but it's not okay for the father to go along with the biological orientation of this. So this is the way this is being prohibited. Christian teenagers who had committed themselves, for example, to saving sexual activity for marriage would be prohibited from gathering together to support each other, to remain faithful to their commitment to chastity. And alarmingly, the laws as currently drafted would even prevent a psychologist from trying to convert the attractions of a pedophile. That's what I say, a minor attracted person, a minor attracted pedophile, who maybe didn't want to have that attraction and was seeking help before he acted on it, could not seek out a psychiatrist. Even more frightening is that the complaint does not need to be made in order to trigger an investigation. So they will be looking, the government will be looking to ferret this out. They'll be examining what is said in churches, because I guess presumably the churches will still be meeting online. That makes it a little bit easier for them to monitor what's being said in the churches, doesn't it? Those who violate the bill could face up to 10 years in prison and fines up to $10,000. The bill does not make any exceptions for practices that are sought and received consensually. Again, just like with vaccination, informed consent is out the window. We're going to treat you like a herd. We're going to treat you like a group. Your individual informed consent is not anything they're interested in. All these people who say they're pro-choice, they're not pro-choice. They're not. It outlaws, makes no exceptions for people getting this advice consensually, prompting ire, as the New American points out, from self-identified ex-lesbian Leah Gray, who experienced gender dysphoria as a child, but is now married with a child of her own in a piece entitled, "We've Been Erased by Victoria Politicians." She rails against the efforts made by lawmakers in Victoria to prevent people such as her from seeking the same therapy that she underwent prior to her transformation. She said, 10 years ago, I voluntarily sought counsel from Christian psychologists, ministries, support networks, and people who had walked before me. It was difficult, but I found relief and happiness. every step of my journey will now become illegal under the Victoria government's bill, and that will take effect in 12 months. Caitlin Johnstone pointed out that Biden's Iran policy is no different than Trump's Iran policy, except that it's got a rainbow flag emoji. That's basically it. He has an international policy that is cloaked in the transgenderism, and so the left is so happy about that. But the left that was so upset about Trump's foreign policy of war doesn't care, as long as he's got a rainbow flag emoji. And he's pushing this along, right? She writes, and of course she's out of Australia as well. The new administration in Washington is pursuing exactly the same approach toward Tehran as its predecessor. Only now with the added media coverage because it's a guy enforcing civilian killing sanctions and not the bad orange man. She said everything about the Biden administration is fake. This is a confirmation, however, from the horse's mouth that Biden is, in effect, continuing Trump's Iranian policy. Because he's saying, well, you're going to stop enriching the uranium, or we're going to come after you, right? Which is basically what Trump was saying. She said the mainstream media is fixated, and here's why this is important, folks. Not only does the left give a pass on censorship and demand censorship, but they don't even care about the issues that they said they cared about in terms of war when it is cloaked in a rainbow flag. And then there's this. The mainstream media is fixed on the difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, just like they were fixated on the differences between Trump and Obama 4 years ago. But if you can mentally mute that vapid soundtrack, writes Caitlin Johnstone, and look at the similarities between the administrations instead of the party affiliations, instead of the campaign platforms. Yeah, there's a lot of difference in the campaign platforms, but take a look at what they actually do, right? You'll learn a lot more about what's really going on in the world. I agree with her on that. Got to get past this Hegelian dialectic and actually look at what the people do, not what they campaign on, not even what they say after they're in office, and not how they cloak themselves with one group or the other. You've got Elon Musk getting in trouble with the Department of Justice. Chris Minahan, Information Liberation, points out that Musk is getting in trouble with SpaceX for hiring Americans over non-citizens. And it's actually kind of a Kafkaesque or catch-22 situation. Because this is a space launch, he has to hire people who have the kind of security clearance that the government demands, right? Which means American citizens. I remember when I was at Texas Instruments, there were a lot of people who were, they had a lot of really good engineers who could not work on military-industrial complex contracts, defense work. They kept trying to push me into that because I was an American, and I wasn't going to go into that because I'm an American, and I don't like the military-industrial complex. I don't like the weapons systems because I don't like the way the government is using them in undeclared war. So I was aware of that. It kept trying to push me in there because I could get security clearance. This is before I was telling people what my political views were on air. But it was kind of ironic because the military weapons, because of the long process that they would go through of testing and the conditions on which they would have to test all of the components, it was actually not anywhere close to state of the art either. I mean, they had one of the positions that that they tried to push me into, they had for the cruise missile guidance system. And you would think that'd be something very sophisticated, but actually it was as unsophisticated as the Imperial College of London's model that told Trump that 2.2 million people were going to die. It's written in thousands of lines of Fortran code that I would have been responsible as a a new college graduate for maintaining it. It's like, what a nightmare that would have been. But the people who were doing really interesting stuff were foreign engineers who were foreign nationals, and the consumer electronics stuff that was being done at Texas Instruments was a lot more cutting edge, state of the art. And so the irony was that you had to have security clearance in order to work on the military stuff, but if you really wanted to do state-of-the-art stuff, you could come over as a foreign engineer and they would hire you for those jobs. So I guess that's really kind of where Elon Musk is, his catch-22. He said he'd like to hire more non-citizens, but U.S. government regulations, because it's rocket technology, said this is advanced weapons technology and it prevents him from doing so. So now the Department of Justice is going to investigate him because he doesn't have enough non-citizens. Perhaps this explains what I could not figure out. Why does Musk want to go to Mars so badly? Perhaps he needs to get some illegal aliens that he can use. And they could go to Mars, they could declare it U.S. territory, then he could hire these illegal aliens to come back to Earth and help him with his space propulsion. And then on Long Island Railroad, our last news item here, we have, as the New York Post puts it, a mafia problem. Whoa, that's kind of interesting. Now, I found this interesting because it has some very pertinent similarities to what's going on with Fauci, for example. They said that 5 current and former MTA employees, including sons of 2 convicted mob figures, now face federal conspiracy charges for overtime fraud. So they ask in the New York Post, do the feds need to probe for mafia infiltration of the Long Island Railroad unions? Well, they said the indictment is due in large measures to the Empire Center for Public Policy, which blew the whistle on this. You know, you usually have these things blown out and exposed by whistleblowers or by investigators with an organization or a newspaper, and that's why the information that we have as to how the German lockdowns were calculated to deceive in secret, that has now finally been exposed by a large German newspaper. So we're going to be talking about that. But this is what New York Times found out, along with the Empire Center for Public Policy. They said one of the indicted workers, Thomas Caputo, the chief measurement operator for the Long Island Railroad, took home a whopping $461,000 in 2018 to earn top spot as the MTA's highest paid employee. And they calculated at the newspaper that he would have to be on duty around the clock. He'd have to work 24-hour shifts the entire year to earn all of that overtime. And when you look at it, he got 461. I think it was 416,000 that Fauci got, which was more than the president gets at 400,000. Is there some overtime fraud going on with Fauci? He definitely is working overtime to shut down everybody else, to tell us that his job is essential and nobody else is. Per the indictment, Frank Pizzonia, son of Gambino Captain Dominic Skinny Dom Pizzonia, schemed with Caputo and 3 others by repeatedly covering for one another's absences from work. Payroll records posted online by the Empire Center show Pizzonia earns $35 an hour, but made $271,000 during 2019. See, it's all about the numbers. You can cook the numbers anyway. So it's just like Fauci, right? It's just like the medical mafia that is running our country now. Joseph Balestra, charged with phony billing for 3,000 hours of overtime in 2018, is the son of a convicted weapons dealer to 4 New York City crime families. Well, there you go. Yeah, so we're going to get into some Fauci updates here with the numbers. Before we do, real quickly, I just want to remind you where you can find the broadcasts.
Actually,
and
our website is down at the moment. I'm working on it.
Oh, okay. Well, our website is down at thedavidknightshow.com. Okay, something happened.
It's a host error that he's working
Okay, it's got a host error, so I don't really know what's going on with that. Perhaps they got tipped off by Google to come after us. I don't know what's going on with that. But we'll have to get that moved to Epic wherever this is hosted. But anyway, so let me tell you where you can find us instead of going to that link. So you can find us on Trovo as well as on DLive. I tweet out the links every day. I put them on Twitter as well as Gab. So I've got direct links to that. And for the time being, since we have Periscope still, Periscope's going to go away at the end of March. But I have links to all three of those live broadcasts I put out on Twitter and on Gab before the show starts every morning. And you can also find us on BitChute and on YouTube, David Knight Show. Just look for that. And you can find us on podcast at Podbean, David Knight Show. You'll normally find those links there. Of course, you can also find those links if you go to Twitter. Libertarian is where I am on Twitter. On Gab, it's David Knight Show. So if you go there, you'll find a lot of these links to various places. And if you would like to support us, Podbean is where the podcast goes up. And we're working on that. I think we're going to be able to do that as a live broadcast on Podbean. We're working on that to see if we got the bandwidth for that, to do that, as well as to stream the video broadcast at the same time. Since it's just an audio file, we think we have the broadcast to do that. They have that function at Podbean. So if we have that, we'll let you know about that, because it's also like Periscope and like DLive, and I think maybe even Trovo. Does Trovo have comments for people live? Okay, so all three of those. A live stream, all these live stream places, and if we do have a live stream on Podbean, it would allow people who want to go there and comment with each other. And I know a lot of people like to do that. That was a very popular thing back in the first year of my program before we got banned from YouTube. A lot of people would do that.
Looks like the website is back.
On YouTube. Oh, okay. Travis is saying the website is back up, thedavidknightshow.com. So you can find all those links there. You can find links to how to support us via Subscribestar, PayPal, Venmo, Cash App, Bitcoin, even a P.O. box. They're all there. If you'd like to sign up for a small regular amount on Subscribestar, we really do appreciate that. You can do that. But of course, you can also send individual contributions there at Subscribestar, and you can send individual contributions with PayPal. There's a direct link on The David Knight Show, on thedavidknightshow.com, as well as if you want to use the email address, you can send contributions. And if you want to send us comments, you can also do that to davidknightshow@protonmail.com. davidknightshow@protonmail.com. I have a comment here that is very important, because I read a letter the other day from a listener who is facing a very bad situation at work over random testing. I mean, this is not just about wearing a mask. And look, I understand when I see people wearing the mask. I don't wear a mask. I do it as a protest, and I don't get angry with employees who wear masks. I do get angry with business owners, and I've had a couple of these situations at a restaurant, and where it was the owner who told me that I couldn't come in and walk 5 feet to the table. And so I'm kind of staying away from restaurants, because it's not good for me to get into public shouting matches with people, and I do lose my temper with that. But I understand what's happening to the employees, and I really am sympathetic to them. And this is a very difficult time for a lot of people. It's not a good job market. You don't want to lose your job. People need to be able to support themselves and their families. And so I understand, even if the employer is being unreasonable, even if the employer is taking measures that are going to ultimately require that employer to lose their business, right? They're now selling not the rope that is used to hang them, as Lennon said, but they're using the mask and these Fauci rituals that are going to be used to put them out of business. But I had an individual who was working at a Tyson processing plant, meat processing plant, and or maybe chicken, I don't know. Tyson chicken, I think, is it chicken? Chicken's meat, right? Whatever. Is a tomato a vegetable or a fruit? Anyway, so you get into that kind of. Bottom line is, they insisted on doing random testing. Now, testing is a different issue. I mean, that's a very invasive thing, even more so in a way than the mask is. The mask has real health issues, real health consequences, especially for extended period uses. I think it is very abusive. I hate that policy. I detest Fauci and these people for doing this to us, and I detest the business owners doing it. But I don't fault the people, the poor people who need a job and are doing this to keep their job. But the listener said that he was not fired, But he was put on leave of absence, and that's in many ways even worse because he can't collect even unemployment. And so they want him to quit. And of course, if you quit, then that means that you can't collect unemployment either, technically, right? And so I had another listener, Felicia, send this to me. And this is, I hope he's listening. I'm going to send this to him, forward this information to him, but to other people who are listening as well. And perhaps he is listening today, his regular listener, he said. She said, I watch your show on BitChute every evening. I was a supporter when you were on InfoWars. You were the only commentator I would watch because you were completely honest. The others were, well, let me not get into this. Let's get to the point. You read a letter from a listener about how his job is coercing him to get the experimental government injectables, okay? And in this particular case, it was also a random test. And they doesn't have any help. You honestly stated that you didn't have any advice for people who find themselves in this situation. However, I also watch Highwire, The Highwire, with Del Bigtree, and that's an excellent program. He does it on Thursdays, every Thursday, live. His organization, and he's here in Austin. I've interviewed him multiple times. I have a great deal of respect for Del Bigtree. He has been right about this from the very beginning. He wasn't fooled by any of this because on an annual basis, he worked very closely with RFK Jr. on the vaccine false narratives about flu and vaccines in general, the flu vaccines and vaccines in general. And they realize, as I said before, this is the same MO that we've seen every year from Fauci and the CDC. But Del Bigtree, The Highwire, and he has an organization. It's actually a charitable organization. I Can Decide. I think its initials are ICAN, something like that. But it is at icandecide.org. So he said, if you want, he's got lawyers who help people, bottom line. So if you need help with some of these issues, forced or coerced vaccines by corporations or businesses, or coerced tests by these individuals, he's got lawyers who are willing to help with this. If you want to email him, freedom@icandecide.org, icandecide.org. Tell him I sent you. Tell him Felicia sent you through the David Knight Show. Please write back to your listener, tell him to email this, and I will. He has attorneys willing to take these types of cases. I jotted this information down for myself when I saw it. As of now, my employer has decided to make it voluntary. But we all know there'll be a lot of pressure put on employers to push this and make it mandatory. All right, let's talk a little bit about nullification. Which countries will ban fossil fuel cars first? Right? And I put this under nullification. There's some more specific stuff. We got updates about this proposed law out of, I think it was South Dakota that I told you about on Monday. And later on Monday, it's a South Dakota ballot issue. There was another one that was coming out of Arkansas that was about gun control. So I got an update for those. But understand that when we're talking about nullification and we're talking about the agendas of the Biden administration, whether you're talking about direct attacks on Christianity coming through the transgender issues or through the so-called Equality Act that the Democrats already passed in the House last year, and now they may push that through in the Senate. But when you are looking at what agendas they're pushing out there, one of them, of course, is to get rid of fossil fuel use. And so when we talk about which countries are going to ban fossil fuel car sales first, when they come out with these arbitrary prohibitions and bans on behavior or on different things, I mean, we're talking about government that used to ban alcohol, right? They had to have a constitutional amendment, the 18th Amendment. I've said before, I went to it was actually a convention that had a lot of think tanks from all 50 states. And when they had a party, they put out an invitation that was going to be themed around the 1920s and a speakeasy theme. And when they were handing out the invitations, they said, just knock on the door and tell them that you're here for the ethanol subsidy, right? And we're not going to get to that kind of alcohol prohibition anymore, but we are going to get to petroleum prohibition. We are. They're going to prohibit the fuel, I think, even before they prohibit the car sales. We need to understand how we're going to push back on some of this stuff. And again, as Eric Peters has said in the past, if you get a diesel engine, it's very hard to refine gasoline yourself. Okay, but diesel engines will run on a wide variety of fuels. I mean, you can run them on vegetable oil, recycled from restaurants if you wish. So you can make some minor modifications. They're very, very durable. So if you want to start planning for the future, while you can still get some diesel cars, you might want to get them and learn something about their maintenance and alternative fuels if you want to be able to be mobile, because that's really what they're going to do. Just like they come after the ammunition, I think that's going to be a key part of their gun control. If they want to ban cars, they're going to come after fuel. Climate Wars is a report that came out of Bank of America, their equity strategist there. And he was talking about which countries are set to ban gasoline cars first, because this is a key part of the UN 2030 agenda, which what we've seen with the pandemic as they've enforced all these different rules, they didn't have anything there that outright banned automobile usage. So now we've got the Biden administration coming in. A lot of these people like Biden and others are saying, we put all these regulations down here on you to limit things that you do and your travel, and we need to keep those permanent. And so now they're going to move in the name of climate control. They're going to move to make these restrictions that they put in, because that's what this is all really about. It was about the restrictions. It was never about saving the climate or saving the planet from a climate change. It was never about saving us from a pandemic. It was always about imposing this UN 2030 agenda. They claimed it was for sustainability, and then they claimed it was to protect us from the pandemic. But they want to put this in, and they want to expand it by bringing back the climate change alarmism and by putting in prohibitions. And so you see him moving immediately on the very first day. His very first action was to shut down the Keystone Pipeline and put 11,000 people, union workers, presumably who voted for him, out of work. But more than a dozen countries have now announced future bans on gasoline cars. And the time frame on this is centered around 2030. And they will all be moving it prior to 2030. We've already seen the automobile bans in the UK move to a sooner date, right? It's going to be like 2050, then 2045, and then 2035, and so forth. The first bans include Belgium and Norway in 2025. In 2030, Germany, India, the Netherlands, Denmark, Israel, Sweden, Ireland, and the UK. While most of the U.S. has not yet committed to banning gasoline car sales, California is the only state that has said that by 2035, it could do so. Under a Biden administration, we assume more and more states will soon announce their plans to ban gasoline cars. And lastly, by 2040, Canada, France, Taiwan, Spain, and Singapore announced that they will ban gasoline car sales. Now, before they ban the sale of gasoline cars and diesel cars, diesel is earlier. I mean, even in the UK, they're banning or they're adding extra fees if you have a diesel car and you park it. They have extra additional parking fees to park a diesel car. So they are going to be coming after any kind of fossil fuel. They're going to be moving these dates up. And what they're going to do is they're first of all going to try to make the fuel incredibly expensive. And they're going to try to shut it down at the source, which is the same approach that they make with ammunition, trying to make ammunition, and they've succeeded in that already. Some ammunition, as I had a listener send it to me, said, look at this, and one on-site, and I forget what it was. I forget if it was 9mm, but it was like $2 a round. I said, this is insane. And so they're making ammunition, and they're going to make fuel prohibitively expensive, and then they will just outright ban it. And I think they'll do that before you have the banning of the automobiles. So let's talk about some of the ways that we can push back against the government. And for example, you're not going to be able with nullification to keep the production of gasoline going, but you could, if you had people who were of like mind in your area, you could prohibit You could stop the prohibition of the use of these cars. So again, if you had a diesel car that you were using to run running it off of vegetable oil, you could stop the prohibition of your being able to use that car. I mean, this is where we are. You need to take a realistic approach as to where these people are. They've got a lot of momentum. They got long-term plans. They have all of these universities and media working together to push this agenda. So you better start operating from the standpoint that they're going to succeed. Do everything that you can to stop it. Do everything that you can to educate people as to why we do not want this. But you better start operating on the assumption that they're going to succeed. So how are you going to survive in that world where they have started banning everything? A lot of these things, it's very important for us to do it with nullification. As a matter of fact, there was a bill in South Dakota that I talked about that was going to ban any kind of government gun control, saying that if you're going to do this, if there's any federal gun control laws, they don't apply if the guns are manufactured, sold, and used in the state, if they don't cross state lines. But they were able to shut that down on Monday. And the New American points out that one of the key groups that was involved in shutting down this nullification of unconstitutional federal laws imposed on the states using the 9th and 10th Amendment. This organization that was very involved in this was the Convention of States. And I hear a lot of conservatives who are pushing constitutional amendments, pushing things through the Convention of States, naively thinking that they can have a constitutional convention and they can limit it to balancing the budget, requiring the Congress to balance the budget or whatever their pet project is. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I don't think that I trust any of these politicians. Who's going to be writing the new Constitution? Who's going to represent us in this, right? Well, it's going to be the same people that are in government right now that don't obey the Constitution. See, we don't have a flawed Constitution. We have a Constitution that's ignored. Constitution has not failed. They have failed to obey it and to obey their oath to follow it. As New American points out, it was a good idea to Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and to James Madison, the father of the Constitution, and it might have been utilized by many to thwart the recapture of fugitive slaves. But to a regional director of the Convention of States, nullification would lead to anarchy. David Schneider, a regional director for the Convention of States organization, opposed a bill defeated on Monday in South Dakota legislature that would have been a practical way for the South Dakota legislature to block federal laws that are unconstitutional. And that's why I mentioned a lot of times the conservatives will try to go through and focus on something like gun control, and they don't realize that it's already been done with medical marijuana. You can stop the federal government. The federal government doesn't have the authority to prohibit marijuana, and they don't have the authority to put out any gun control laws either, because we have a Second Amendment prohibiting that. The bill that Snyder opposed would call for the appointment of a legislative committee to rule on the constitutionality of federal laws. And that was part of, they're pushing it to gun owners and said, we'll have a committee that looks at these executive orders coming from Biden or any legislation coming from the Democrat Congress, the House and the Senate, and we will shut that down if we find that it is not constitutional by a committee. And that's exactly what the 10th Amendment is about. You don't have to appeal to a court system over whether or not this is constitutional. That is not anarchy. That is a separation of powers. That was what this was intended, how it was intended to work. Were the committee to find that a law violates the U.S. Constitution, they would refer the issue to the entire legislature. And then if 2/3 of each house were to find the law unconstitutional, the state would not obey the law. As New American points out, this hardly seems extreme. Rather than a law that does not follow the Constitution. As Chief Justice John Marshall said in Marbury versus Madison, a law that is repugnant to the Constitution is void. Now, like Jefferson, I don't like the major thrust of Marbury versus Madison because what it wound up doing in the 20th century especially was to not just give the power to the Supreme itself, that so we're not going to allow abortion under certain circumstances. And the Supreme Court said, no, we're going to shut down that law. We're going to nullify your state law. And by doing so, what they did was they made abortion legal. And you hear everybody saying, well, Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. No, it isn't. Judges don't write laws. And so the nullification of it is good. If they legislate and if they're writing laws to put out their opinion, then that is a problem. While Marshall and his cousin Thomas Jefferson disagreed on some matters, on this issue they were in agreement that the Constitution was the supreme law of the land, not laws passed by Congress that do not follow the Constitution. In 1798, Congress passed the Sedition Act. Listen to how similar this sounds. As a matter of fact, they've already started talking about putting sedition charges on people who were involved with the Capitol riot or the events leading up to it. So let's go back and look at what happened in the past when we had a Sedition Act. 1798. Remember, the Constitution was done in 1789. So we're not even a decade out from the Constitution being created. It provided for criminal penalties for anyone who is critical of the president or members of his cabinet or the leadership of Congress. Think about that. Is that not what we're looking at right now? Democrats trying to recreate the Sedition Act of 1798. I mean, they've extended it. It's not just being critical of the president, of members of his cabinet, or the leadership of Congress. It now includes being critical of an election. If you criticize an election, if you question an election, which these people all did 4 years ago, right? But if you question an election now, that is an act of sedition, according to these people. It is a big power grab. We should be very concerned about this. We should be concerned about this kind of mindset, the seditious mindset that is being promulgated and being pushed by this militarization, this lockdown in Washington, this big theatrical security movement of all the National Guard there, as well as this impeachment trial. But what happened in 1798? The Federalist-controlled Congress passed this law only 7 years after the First Amendment was added to the Constitution, explicitly denying the Congress the authority to bridge freedom of speech or freedom of press. And so 7 years later, so the Constitution was passed in 1789, and then they add the Bill of Rights. So seven years after the Bill of Rights, they passed a law making it illegal to criticize the administration. When the Federalist judges, who were sworn to follow the Constitution, proceeded to apply the law against those accused of violating it, Jefferson and Madison wondered how to protect the citizens of their states of Virginia against this unconstitutional law, considering that the federal judges would not do their sworn duty. So they had a very similar situation. We don't want anybody to question our narrative. We don't want anybody to criticize us. And if you do, we're going to put you in jail. And they looked at it and they said, well, we can't rely on the judges to stop this either, because the judges are the same political party and they want the same results. They want this kind of censorship. And this is 7 years after they had passed the First Amendment. So they came up with the idea of anonymously writing, Jefferson and Madison did, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which asserted that in such a situation, the state governments had a duty to protect their citizens from unconstitutional law. And that is still the case. We have a division of power because each one of these branches of government at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, everybody who swears to the Constitution must uphold it against illegal actions and laws of other branches. And that still applies today. As a matter of fact, as I pointed out, there's a Department of Justice law to criminalize somebody in government who is conspiring to take away your liberty, your constitutional liberties. And that is something that should be used against Fauci, against these unelected public health officials, against governors who are pushing these lockdowns, and quite frankly, against presidents with their executive orders, including Trump, who started all this with his executive order. But getting back to this, nullification has been employed at various times in American history, and one of the reasons that you see it slandered is because they say, well, that was part of the lead up to the Civil War, right? In 1832, you had the South Carolina Nullification Act. That was a response to massive tariffs that were put in 1828. They called them the Tariffs of Abomination. And the standard government textbook analysis of history takes the Civil War back to this dispute about nullification. And then they say, and it's all about, the Civil War was all about slavery, and so therefore nullification and secession are racist, right? The problem is that the fight in 1832, which nearly began a civil war, was not about slavery. It was about taxes. And it was about industrial interests who were in the ascendancy at the time. It was about them setting government policy on taxes, on tariffs. Taxes when the goods are crossing the border, because they did not have an internal income tax in those days. They ran the government off of the federal government, was small enough to fit inside the Constitution, and they were able to run it off of fees for imports and exports. But the people who were in the South with their agrarian society, they were trying to, they wanted free trade without taxes because they were exporters. And the industrial interests wanted to have a protectionist policy because they were manufacturers domestically. And eventually, this did not happen at this time, and I've used this illustration before when I've talked to people about the fourth turning. I said the only reason this didn't erupt into a civil war at that time was because it was not at the point of time of a fourth turning. You had the Revolutionary War, which was a fourth turning. Every 4 generations, you have a restructuring of society, for example, and that's a pattern of history that has gone back. Strauss and Howe identified it going back 500 years in history. They looked at generations. They're the ones who coined the term millennial and so forth. And so you had 1776 in the American Revolution, and then you had another fourth turning at the Civil War. And they call them a fourth turning because it's like every 80 years, every 4 generations, you have that kind of structure. Even though these issues surfaced and almost tore the country apart in 1830, it didn't happen at that time because there wasn't a mindset in the general population that wanted to overturn and restructure society at that point in time. It happened in the 1860s, and it was part of the change from an agrarian society to an industrial society, and it happened in Italy at the same time in exactly the same way, and many other places where they were having they were creating the nation state, which is based around the Industrial Revolution. Slavery was not an issue in Italy, and slavery was not an issue in this nullification thing, but they tried to make the connection back to it. So they almost had a secession with that in South Carolina. Andrew Jackson was able to broker a compromise because, again, it was not at the point where society in general wanted to have a separation. That came 30 years later. And as they point out in this, when you try to tie this in the Civil War, nullification wasn't the issue in the Civil War 30 years later. Secession was the issue. And I said, contrary to claims, nullification was never used to defend the institution of slavery. As a matter of fact, it did just the opposite. Nullification was used before the Civil War by states like Wisconsin and Michigan to prevent the enforcement of the fugitive slave law, the Dred Scott decision, things like that. They nullified that. They nullified that. And they refused to cooperate with this enforcement. So getting back to the issues at hand, the Convention of States organization favors the calling of a national constitutional convention to propose amendments to the Constitution. And they ridicule the use of nullification. They call it dangerous. They say it is anarchy. They say it will lead to a civil war and so forth. And so, on the other hand, James Madison, these people who wrote Madison and Jefferson, who wrote the Virginia resolutions talking about nullification, Madison said he did not support another national convention. He said he feared for the future of the country if one were ever held. Scalia, former Supreme Court justice, told the Federalist Society, the 21st century is a very bad century in which to write a constitution. And so we should be very concerned about it, and we should be very concerned about the fact that efforts to have the Ninth and 10th Amendment enforced to protect our God-given liberties are being shut down at the state level. That's exactly where we need to have more strength applied to nullify. We need to have more of a check and balance against this concentration of power in Washington, against the types of things that we're seeing with Biden having 45 executive orders. Now, in South Dakota, you've also had a judge has now overruled the will of the voters on behalf of Republican Governor Kristi Noem. Now, she's been one of the better governors in terms of not implementing the guidelines and recommendations of Fauci, even though there are federal incentives to do so. She has held the line on that. But there was a referendum on legalizing recreational marijuana in South Dakota, and it passed with 54% of the vote. Kristi Noem and some law enforcement officers took this issue to court. As a matter of fact, she had the state pay for the cost of challenging this. So the state was paying for both sides of this to go to court. And as Reason Magazine points out, she opposed legalization, and rather than accepting the will of the voters, Kristi Noem in South Dakota went to court to try to block it. She even paid the legal fees of the challenge to do this. A South Dakota Sixth Circuit judge ruled the constitutional amendment did not follow the proper state processes for approval and is therefore void. This is an amendment that was passed with 54% of the people. She said, first, by attempting to both legalize marijuana and to establish licensing and regulatory processes, the ballot initiative violated rules that require an amendment focused only on a single subject. Now, that is the kind of legal prevarication that we constantly see in the court systems. As Reason Magazine points out, it may appear to those of us who just are not lawyers, right? Those of us who don't have an agenda, it might appear that regulating marijuana could reasonably be seen as a single subject. But she said no. And then she said that the legal test here as to whether or not parts of amendments are, quote, governing a process so related and interdependent as to constitute a single scheme. She also found an additional flaw. She ruled that the initiative didn't just amend a part of the state constitution, but it revised the Constitution by changing the structure of the state's government by taking power away from the legislature to determine marijuana policy. Now, they didn't point this out in the Reason article, but when I read that statement, I thought, well, wait a minute, that would mean that you couldn't have the First Amendment to the Constitution, right? Because what is the very first part of the very first amendment to the Constitution? Congress shall make no law abridging the free exercise of religion or freedom of speech and so forth. So the first thing it does is it takes power away from the Congress. It takes power away from the federal government. And so that's what she has a problem with. This is Again, the kind of legal arguments that destroy our country. Sponsors of the ballot initiative said they're going to appeal it to a higher court. It has to be nullified. But this begins to be a problem when it is challenged within the state. I remember years ago, there was a sheriff in Telluride, Colorado, and they would have a film festival there. And this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, when the war on drugs was a hot new topic, and everybody was figuring out how they could ramp up and militarize the police and have SWAT teams and all this other kind of stuff. But this sheriff is kind of like an Andy Taylor. He said, I'm not going to bust people for smoking pot or whatever, in this small town. And he was not going to be intimidated by the feds. He was not going to be bribed by the feds either to do that. He said, I took an oath to the Constitution. I'm not going to harass these people over this stuff. It's their decision. It's not mine. I'm not going to. If they do something and they start getting rowdy, or they get high and they start driving recklessly, then I'll do something. But just possession of this, I'm not going to go around kicking down doors for that. And that's when we have a state where you have the governor overturning the will of the people in a referendum. About the only thing you got left is maybe to have some sheriffs who are going to help you. And then the final resort that you have, if you don't have a sheriff there, you have nullification through juries. Jury nullification, the final protection of our freedoms. And you're going to have to represent yourself, most likely, because most lawyers will not challenge the legal system to that extent. The courts do not like the idea of jury nullification, and they want to punish lawyers who do. So you have a few lawyers who are courageous enough to make that argument, but not many. So they said it may well be that the legalizers will get what they want given amount of time. There are 16 Republicans in the South Dakota state legislature that have formed a cannabis caucus to work on marijuana regulations. It does not appear to be the case that members of one party or even the majority of a single party are standing in the way. The issue here is not pot use. The issue here is how do we have nullification? How do we stop laws that are out of control? And how do we stop prohibition? Because whether you're talking about prohibiting people from getting psychiatric help, whether you're talking about prohibiting people from talking about what is and is not sin, or whether you're talking about prohibiting people from getting not just psychiatric help, but getting the help of Jesus Christ to change their life, right? This is not something that you're really going to be able to do in your own strength. But Christ can change anything in any of us, and we all have things that we need to have changed. But you're going to shut that down. You're going to prohibit that, or you're going to prohibit somebody from using something for a medical purpose, which is the whole point of the FDA. Everything is prohibited unless they expressly permit it. So, and that includes things like, hydroxychloroquine, for example, if you got an illness. That's what we need to be concerned about. That's what we really need to fight. And we need to understand that our tools are going to be nullification at the state level. If you've got a governor and a legislature who don't appreciate a state referendum and will go to court to try to overturn the will of the people. And that's what we saw, for example, with the marriage redefinition that was done by the Supreme Court. Everywhere they went, where they overturned the traditional definition of marriage, and that's something that was supported by every culture, by every religion. Even in Greece, where homosexuality was rampant, they never proposed homosexual marriage. They understood that marriage was for producing a family, for producing children and so forth. But even in California, where you had Tim Cook and Apple incentivize, Tim Cook gave massive amounts of money. They offered to match any contributions of Apple employees to fight a referendum that would define marriage as between one man and one woman. And they lost. They lost in every state, including California. So the Supreme Court just decided that they would overrule it. That's what we're now seeing here. And regardless of what you think about these issues, regardless of what you think about marriage or what you think about with recreational use of marijuana, that's why I like to talk about these other issues that, you'll have people will divide on conservative versus liberal. You have to understand the structures that are being put in. And if you make the government criminal, you have to worry about that. If you authorize an authoritarian government to dictate things, you're not going to like what they dictate. And it doesn't matter where you are in the political spectrum. They're going to come after you eventually. Let's talk about America held hostage before we get into the Trump trial. It was kind of interesting, as we had, went viral over the weekend, the report where the NBC reporter went in and was just aghast. Oh, yes, I was going in to, get a cup of coffee or something, he claimed. And he did a report to shame this grocery store in Naples, Florida, and everybody loved what they saw, just like churches that are going about their business, people who are shopping in this grocery store going about their business, and they cannot have that because it exposes the lie of their pandemic. Look at all these people, many of them in Naples, elderly, and they're not dying. There's no pandemic. No more people died in 2020 than died in the preceding years. There is no pandemic. There's no epidemic. There is no pandemic except for a pandemic of political tyranny. That is an epidemic that is in every jurisdiction. That's the definition of pandemic, an epidemic that is everywhere. Well, this is an epidemic of tyranny, and it has become a pandemic. After seeing a video of shoppers and workers without masks happily going about their business in a Florida grocery store, an emergency room doctor with over 153,000 followers tweeted, "Let them die. I'm so tired of these people." It's a story from LifeSite News. Then he went on to say, "No vaccines for y'all." And I looked at this, and the first thing I thought was, you've got a doctor, an emergency room doctor with 153,000 followers? I mean, typically, you don't see that kind of following from somebody unless they are some kind of person that's in media. I mean, that's more followers than I've got because, I assume that if he's pushing this pandemic, he has the blessings and the promotion of Twitter, which I do not have, but he's got 153,000 followers. So I thought this guy must be a very well-known alarmist, because he must be telling everybody all the time, I'm seeing people in my emergency room dying all the time from COVID and on and on and on. And I've got people writing me who work in emergency rooms, who work in ambulances saying, we're not seeing it. And my coworkers aren't seeing it. But my coworkers, even though we see this on a daily basis, have you seen people coming in dying of COVID? No, I haven't seen it. Do you realize it's false? Well, I know I hear CNN tell me it's true, So anyway, it's very useful for them to have doctors like this. And they will promote him if he's going to tell everybody that he sees people in his emergency room all the time, dying from COVID. This is a doctor. His handle is Clevon MD. And he went on to say, Republicans, he took down that tweet, but it was recorded by other people and took screenshots of it. He said, Republicans are the problem for trying to take my words out of context if I deny medical care to people that don't wear masks. He went on to immediately contradict himself, as LifeSite News said, admitting that my point is, we can't waste our time on these COVID deniers. They're not going to protect themselves, so let them die. Well, he just restated it again in a different way, right? Let them die. They'll find out the hard way. Okay. Well, you know what you call the person who graduates at the bottom of their medical class? Clevon MD. That's the old joke, right? Or you could call him Governor Ralph Northam, right? That's the people who graduate at the bottom of their class who were there because they flunked ethics, right? And then you got CNBC Shepard Smith joining in. I've seen the clips of this, and you probably have too by this time. It's been around for about a week. Shaming this and saying, well, we all fantasize about a time when we won't have to wear the masks anymore, but that time is not now. a minority. I mean, you just look at the White Coat Summit doctors, or you look at, and he wound up having to fight the medical community. He had to fight the political community. Same thing with the White Coat Summit doctors. Trump didn't give them a platform. He let them twist in the wind. He continued to put Fauci. But as for me, I stayed. I had, here's another letter from Michael in New York. He said, I came across a paid ad from a Democrat congressional campaign committee. Wanted me to sign a card and to thank Dr. Fauci. Isn't that interesting? Here's a picture. Thank you, Dr. Fauci. And you can sign the card and send that to him as thanks. And of course, the Democrats do want to thank him. What do they want to thank him for? They want to thank him for sticking the Donald Trump were to, pull away the football. So yeah, the major shutdown of the economy in a presidential election year. Dr. Cleavon, we got Dr. Fauci, another Dr. Politician, right? These guys are politicians more than anything else. I got to say, again, my suspicion is, I got to confess, I did not investigate it. I did not go to Cleavon MD's Twitter account. But if he's got 153,000 followers, and if he's loved that dearly by these people, he's got to be pushing alarmism just like Fauci. He is a political doctor more than anything else. Fauci's got even more followers than 100. Piper, who has kidnapped our kids and is destroying the rest of our society as well, right? So yeah, thank you for getting rid. We had always dreamed of having a situation where we could make up anything and get people to do it. Kind of like a Simon Says. Love to play that Simon Says game. Now they got Jeremy Corbyn is his brother, who was head of the Labor Party, and I said, "This is really strange." I mean, this guy, it might be like the Hitchens brothers. One of them, a guy who is a hardcore atheist, the other one is a hardcore Christian apologist. Maybe these guys are in different areas here, or maybe, I don't know, Jeremy Corbyn may be a climate change peers, definitely is, because he was a meteorologist. He knows. Street preacher, town center for continuing to preach during the coronavirus lockdown. Now, Corbyn, Piers Corbyn, not only a climate skeptic, but also a COVID skeptic. And I said, I believe that, like me, he sees the overlap of these two agendas. Being sold. They were selling a lie. They were trying to hide the data from people that was the basis for all of this. And stick nonsense. Happen. And it was based on junk science. And as I said before, I worked with a group that was suing Michael Mann and the University of Virginia, where he produced those bogus studies. We said, show us the data. what you based it on. Working at a state university and you're being paid at the state university and you did this, all these emails where you're talking back and forth to these people conspiring to cover up the fact that your models failed. How do we hide the decline about their climate change models? And yet they were allowed to get away with that. So I think probably you got Piers Corbyn understands that. He understands the method, and he knew exactly what they wanted to impose on us with this alarmism, and he sees them imposing it if you do. And he said, in this, he said, and dressed as a corona condom. Even a condom, what does that look like? Oh, that's right, it's a face mask, I guess. Right? A face mask is prophylactic, so we should start calling them, instead of face diapers, we should call them face condoms or something, right? Corona condoms. Approximately to support the right of a man to stand on a corner and preach, because they want to lock that down, just like we saw in Idaho, where they wanted to lock down Doug Wilson's church that was meeting. They would have a once a month singing before all this insanity started. And so we're going to go back and do that again. And they were out in the open, in an open park, and they arrested some people. So anyway, they had officers, mounted officers on horses, officers from other stations attended, and they fined and arrested people. Because, you know, they were not doing what Fauci and these other public health experts say. So what is Fauci saying now? Well, he's made some new pronouncements on Fox News. He went on with Bret Baier. And time when we're going to have no masks, Fauci said, that'll really be dependent on how we get the level of the virus in the community down. If we can get, and I have to use an estimate here, he doesn't have any real numbers, right? He's always got to estimate the numbers. Because if it's an estimate, and he says, and it's not definitive, oh, it's not? I thought we were dealing with science here, right? How can we're dealing with estimations? We're dealing with guesses? Or are we dealing with science? As I pointed out many times. Well, Fauci doesn't have a measurement of this because he doesn't even beginning to understand it. If we can get 70 to 85% of the population vaccinated, and to get to then at that point, you can start thinking in terms of not having a uniform wearing of masks. So that's it. It's a uniform, isn't it? It's a veil. It's a veil. Bow to my religion. And my religion, men and women wear veils. Because I mean, even Fauci, we should start calling him the imam. And it's a uniform. It's like a communist pajama uniform that you got to wear. But he went on. He said, "But we're certainly not there yet. When do I think that would occur? It's very difficult to predict, Brett. But if everything falls on some of the public health measures as we get into the late fall of this year, but there's no guarantee on that." There you go. tooth and nail. And I'll never forget Mike Adams, who we had Alex likes to say, well, you disagree with this person? Why don't you debate him? I did, Alex, on the facts. I don't need to debate Steve Pieczenik. The facts have debated Steve Pieczenik. History has and time have refuted what Steve Pieczenik had to say. I don't have to do it. I mean, I gave my opinion. The problem I had with Mike Adams was that he was pushing. Look at this. Nobody's dying anymore from heart disease and cancer. The number one killer is COVID. It's like, come on. Just like Del Bigtree, just like me, Mike Adams had in the past looked at the flu vaccines. He operated and he said, well, you better wear the mask. If you don't wear the mask now, you don't get this terrible Chinese bioweapon under control, you're going to have to take the vaccine. I said, do you hear that? Mike Adams said you got to wear natural news? Natural news? You got to wear the mask or you're going to get the vaccine? Are you kidding me? The mask is training you to get the vaccine. The mask is telling you the same thing they told you about vaccines always. Your vaccine does not protect you, it protects other people. It's like, that doesn't even pass basic logic. And they're saying the same thing about the mask. Mask doesn't protect you, it protects other people. Because it is the placeholder, it is the training. And they know that it's going to be around for a while, so you got some people who are making some very expensive masks. Wall Street Journal says face masks are going high tech. Oh, yeah. So you can now get a face mask that costs $150 because it is a smart mask for stupid people. Whenever they call something smart, it's because they're selling it to stupid people. The whole sell to stupid people. And so this $150 mask comes you can't breathe. We saw last summer when they had the anti-fob BLM things happening, even here in this small town outside of Austin. No mask. We're driving around maskless just to annoy people, but we enjoy it too. We drive around with the top down and no mask on, and we see people in cars by themselves wearing masks with the windows up. And it's like, I don't know what world I'm living in anymore. But we're driving through the town, and there's a little group of college-aged kids standing there with signs, about BLM and all this other kind of stuff. And they had masks on that said, I can't breathe. And so I shouted to them, I said, take your mask off. And it didn't register with them as we were driving by. But you can't breathe, take your mask off. So it measures this smart mask for stupid people, measures your breathing rate, and alerts you when it is time to change the disposable equivalent filter. They say it's an N99. Well, that means it probably is. You probably do need your face to minimize air leaks. The mask doesn't feel scratchy like other medical grade models the reporter says I've used. Well, I didn't know they felt scratchy because I haven't worn any of these. People even nerdier than me, says the reporter, will like the fact that it tracks your location to let you know the quality of the air and the approximate number of particles that it's protected you against. Do you see how they come up with bogus numbers? Like, because they air quality levels. And then it extrapolates out of that some bogus number and tells you how many millions of particles it's filtered. It's absolute nonsense. It's kind of like the models that Fauci used. Then there's another model, the N95 equipped masked phone, only $50. That's a third of the price of this other one. It has integrated wire buds to prevent the dreaded mask muffle on calls. So in other words, you're trying to make a phone call and people can't hear you, which is another issue that I have with people wearing these things. Well, it's got earbuds so that it can by exhaling. And all these are designed, according to the manufacturers, for a world in where even getting vaccinated doesn't obviate the need to wear a face covering. See? That lie about vaccine mocked fry, that lie that Fauci was just talking about? Well, I don't know if we get 75, 85% of the suckers, the people out there to get vaccinated. It might go away, but I can't promise you nothing here. Well, they have promised that it's not going to go away. And they know it's not going to go away because they're going to do this. And if you're a sucker who's going to pay $50 to $150 for a smart mask, you're going to get to the airport, and according to the regulations coming out of the CDC, which this reporter did not report with the Wall Street Journal, the CDC says you can't have a mask that has some kind of a vent or valve in it. Both of these masks do. So you get to the airport and the CDC will not let you use that mask. You probably have to go get a piece of cloth and put it over your face. Speaking of masks, we had Buttigieg and his booty buddy virtue signaling to everybody with two masks. They had a black mask underneath it. They had a white mask, and they skewed it a little bit so that you could see that they're wearing two masks because this is all about the virtue signaling and the compliance and everything. But even though he's wearing two masks, now Buttigieg is in quarantine because somebody in detail tested positive. And so even though he's not sick, even though he was wearing two masks, and obviously the two masks are not protective enough, obviously by his actions, he doesn't believe the two masks protected him. So he's got to self-isolate with his booty buddy, who has now become the transportation secretary of Biden, says that he's considering a requirement that passengers have to not just wear a mask, but now they got to go the next step because it's always going to be something else. If we don't stop these people, if we don't stop obeying these people, and I hope you see this because we're not even at a year yet, but every couple of weeks they're adding a new requirement. Okay, you don't have to wear a mask. Now you got to wear a mask. Now you got to wear two masks. Now you got to wear 3 masks or 4 masks. Now you got to wear a mask and get a test in order to fly domestically, right? It never ends because we are sheep. Because we won't take our freedom back because we won't stand. And then we'll have more things that we'll add to you. If we continue to obey these lies and not oppose them, and let me just interject here. I think Jennifer made a very generous contribution to us, and she said you should read a book, Not by Lies, by Rod Dreher. It came out last fall. Out of Russia. And then he came to live in the U.S. and the West, and he said, you guys have got some real moral problems here, too. And he was right about that as well. But what he said to the Russian people was, he said, their authority is built on lies, and the worst lie is that you can't do anything to oppose this. And this totalitarian society. Totalitarian society, meaning not just that they control every aspect of your life, right? Authoritarian control of every aspect of your life, but that totalitarianism extends to the control of your mind. As Rabbi David Smith that I talked to, he said, we got to understand, it's about the 2 + 2 = 5. It's about making the prisoners who have been condemned to be shot, getting your consent to something thing that we can do to oppose this. And if we believe the only hope we had was President Trump, that is the scariest thing when I see that attitude, that you think there's nothing you can do. And you embrace the lies that surrounded Trump, the lies that were sold to you by the QAnon Trust the Plan peoples, that he's playing 4D chess, or that Pachinik saying it's a sting. You know, he's a master chess player. So if you believe those lies, and if you believe, and I've said this before, I said the worst thing about the QAnon thing is not that they would believe the lie, but that they would idolize somebody. It all has to be done by Trump, and they endorse President Trump lying to people to get what he wants done. That's the values of the CIA. That's the values of people like Pachinik and people who are pushing the Trust the Plan. It's 4D chess. Those are CIA values. You get what you want by creating civil wars, because they had talked about a coup and a civil war before Trump. You had Pachinik, you had Jerome Corsi and others talking about how, well, you know, we talked about how we maybe just throw Obama out of office, but then we found out that we could put Trump in. These are people who overthrow governments for a living. Do not follow them. No matter what policies and people or parties they say that they're behind. So the lie that you can't do anything, the lie that it's the art of Sun Tzu. No, it's the art of CIA to lie to people. This kind of Machiavellian, backstabbing lies that we've seen this last 4 years. Embrace that. So let's get back to the lockdown here. Buttigieg is it's going to be guided by this decision. You know, so we're in active discussions with the CDC, and it's going to be guided by data, by science, by medicine. And the safer we can make it, could stop the spread of disease, right? And you have the CDC, Dr. Walensky said she didn't say whether the CDC would move forward. That Buttigieg plans to quarantine after a member of his security detail there. So obviously, again, he doesn't believe in the efficacy of masks. He doesn't believe in the efficacy of two masks. They don't believe in the mask mandates put out by the CDC and Biden and all transportation and so forth, or that they even have the authority to do that. They believe in that. But they don't believe that these masks work in their particular case. But, you know, it's all about the data, the science, and medicine, right? So now you see these headlines. Biden is considering forcing domestic airline passengers. It doesn't matter whether he makes it an executive. It's coming from the CDC. They are the ones who are ruling us. Whether this is, they put a covering on it to say that it's coming from Mayor Pee Wee or from Biden. Good news. Americans have finally begun easing out of the pandemic-induced phobias that sent them scurrying underground nearly a year ago. However, few of them seem to agree on how to come out of hibernation, with many of them waiting for an official okay. So I guess we could say this is going to be our Groundhog Day, right? The Americans kind of know this is over. You know, like the groundhog knows that winter is over. But, you know, if they come out and they see their shadow, they'll be scared and they'll go back underground again. This is Groundhog Day for America, for the world, right? Are we going to be afraid of our going to go back into the dark winter, the Operation Dark Winter lockdown? That's the question. 1 in 3 Americans no longer believes returning to their pre-coronavirus existence poses a moderate or large risk, but only a third. Only a third. So in other words, 2/3 do believe that there is a moderate or large risk if they live life normally. They go on to say that 25% believe that there is a small risk, and only 9%, 60%, 66% are scared of their shadow. Another 25% think it's kind of scary. They see it. And then 9% of us say it's just a shadow. It's a shadow of the truth. It's not the truth. I have absolutely no risk at all from this. Statistically, zero risk. 58% still believes that it represents a moderate or large risk. 58%, nearly 60%. On one end, more than a quarter, that is 28% of Americans, are already attending small parties and gatherings. Well, that makes it, I guess if you add small parties to church attendance, you could get up to 28%. It's probably not too many people who are attending church anymore. 29% of those over 65 years old will say that they will wait for the vaccine before they even consider resuming normal life. The least likely to return to normal anytime soon are the college miseducated Americans and those who are Democrats. Those two are not really two separate groups, right? Being miseducated for an extended period of time in college, the only surefire way to get the U.S. back to normal. Vaccine recipients actually seem to be even more fearful of doing so than any other group. A whopping 70% still believe the virus is a high risk, and most vaccinated Americans continue to wear masks. They continue anti-social distancing, and they otherwise observe the pandemic rituals of Fauci that have been in effect since March. Fully 97% continue to wear a mask despite being vaccinated. See, it is a psychological, political disease. Even if they get the vaccine. You understand that? I mean, as bad as it is that they have assumed the power, even under Trump, they assumed the power to say, well, you're not going to have anybody evicted, even if they're behind, because, we got a coronavirus thing going on. That is not anything that even if they were simply a government agency, and they're not, they have a large private aspect to them. They have patents. They sell billions of dollars worth of vaccines every year. They are a 501c3 corporation, but now they are dictators, but they're dictators of the narrative. The narrative. Republicans are more likely to believe the media's inaccurate information is a deliberate attempt to mislead the viewer rather than a genuine mistake. Yeah, that's what it is. And then you have the new Surgeon General of Biden, and it turns out that he's made a lot of money pushing this pandemic. How about that? What a surprise. Vivek Murthy, Biden's pick. And he is one of these examples of the revolving door. He was in the Obama administration as a health official. Then he gets out into private practice. He offers his services consulting to corporations about the pandemic. Corporations like Carnival Cruise Lines, Netflix, Airbnb. And he made about $1 million last year. He actually made more than Fauci. Of course, we don't know how much Fauci's making on the side with, or family members or whatever, with the stocks from Gilead for pushing remdesivir. I wish we could audit him. Wish we could. And so this is a report coming out of Politico. Speaking, writing, and consulting firms paid him another $500,000. So about this. Now he comes back into the government again. He said, our job is to speak the truth about public health, even when it is controversial or perceived as political. He knows we perceive it as political. The vast majority of Republicans know that it's political. He says, what we're missing here is leadership. We need a leader who will work with the states to ensure that everyone who needs a test gets one and gets results quickly. We need a leader who secures a safe, effective vaccine and distributes it quickly. Well, I thought that was Trump, right? Well, maybe it wasn't safe. That's right. It was not safe. Okay. That's right. It's not effective. It's just quick. So we need somebody who does something that's safe, effective, and quick. Guy obviously is not an engineer. We had a saying in engineering, good, fast, or cheap. Good, fast, and cheap. Pick any two, max. You may not get any one of those three, right? But at most, you're going to get two of those. Good, fast, and cheap. Pick two, maximum. But yeah, it's going to be fast. It's going to remind you, we do have that website back now, Travis, thedavidknightshow.com, thedavidknightshow.com. You can find the links there to where you can links to where you can find me on social media, for example, Gab, as well as Twitter. On Twitter, I'm Libertarian. The rest of these places, it's like the David Knight Show. And where you can find the podcast, because it doesn't just go to Podbean. It goes first to Podbean, and then it is pushed out to iTunes, to Stitcher, to Spotify, and many other places. So we've got a lot of different places where the podcast is right now. And finally, where you can support the show via PayPal, via Subscribestar, Venmo, Cash App, Bitcoin, even regular snail mail. We have all of those links there at thedavidknightshow.com. And we really do appreciate and need your support. Thank you so much. Let's talk about what's going on in Germany now. When I first saw this, I thought, the Koch Institute? I thought, is this the Koch brothers? It certainly seems like the Koch brothers coming up with a fake model to justify the German lockdown. And I thought, well, wait a minute, what are they doing in Germany? I would expect them to be active here in the U.S. It is not the Koch brothers, even though the Koch brothers have given money to the Clintons. They're supposed to be these conservative guys, but they gave a lot of money to the Clintons. No, it's not the Koch brothers. It is the Koch Institute. It is a German institute affiliated with the government. And one of Germany's largest newspapers, Die Welt, in other words, the world, hired scientists from the Koch Institute and several universities to justify the country's strict lockdown measures. And they were able to get documents more than 200 pages. They had to sue them in court, a legal battle with the Koch Institute. And they were able to get internal correspondence between the Ministry of the Interior and the so-called researchers. In one exchange, State Secretary Marcus Kerber asked the researchers to develop a model on which they could base preventative and repressive measures, quote unquote. That's the quote. I need a model. Can you produce a model for me to justify preventative and repressive measures? Not just restrictive, but repressive measures. This is a story, by the way, from Zero Hedge, zerohedge.com. But just think about that. They've got a desired outcome. Repressive measures. And I need you to produce a model that's going to justify that. That's the opposite of science. You don't do science that way. Well, that's politics, right? I want to show that my candidate is winning. Can you do a push poll for me, please? You sample more of this political party than you do the other political party so we can show my candidate winning. Can you do a poll the very last day before the election and you word the questions, not so much, we don't really want to know what the people think, but we want to nudge them and push them in a particular direction on a particular issue, our candidate. And that's what they're doing with this model. It's exactly what was done with the Imperial College of London. They had a desired outcome. They wanted repressive measures. And they produced that, and two very smart people, as President Trump called them, Fauci and Birx, gave him the information showing that 2.2 million people are going to die. And even 7 or 8 months later, President Trump said, I saved 2 million lives. I saved 2 million lives. Now, when Obama said that he had saved, and I forget his number, how many millions of jobs he had saved because of the, and he didn't say, my unemployment figures are getting better. He just said, well, we didn't lose even more jobs. So I saved millions of, and he a cheerleader for him at the time, like we are a cheerleader for Trump, right? But when Obama said jobs saved, we said nobody has ever said jobs saved. Well, President Trump, nobody has ever claimed that they saved lives with this stuff. And your claim that you saved lives was based on a thoroughly discredited model by that time. A model that had a false assumption as to how pandemics work. It ignored Pandemics 101. The whole idea that we're going to flatten the curve, there was no curve in that model to flatten. And then it was written in a way that another university in London pointed out with the same input, and every time you ran it through, even with the same input, you would get a different answer. That's not even a program. That's a bug. In just 4 days, these scientists, working in close coordination with the ministry, developed a working paper in secret, which described a worst-case scenario in which over 1 million people in Germany could die of COVID-19 if social life were to continue as it was before the pandemic. Same thing they did here. 1 million lives in Germany. Of course, we have more people here in America. I don't know, that might be a higher percentage even than they predicted would die in America, but it was the same idea. You go to somebody that has a name. Oh, it's the Imperial College of London. Oh, that's impressive. Or to Germans, the Koch Institute. I want you to develop a model to justify repressive measures. I want you to tell everybody that we're going to have millions of people die. And they do it in secret. They do it in 4 days, and it takes nearly a year of legal fighting to get this information released. Based on the dire projections, the German state responded with sweeping legislative changes to long-standing laws and enacted strict measures, including unprecedented lockdowns that began in March. This was all done, by the way, before, just like the simulation in London, it was all done before the executive orders, before the lockdowns. Lawsuits in Germany challenging the Constitution. We've even seen that here in America. Americans are so dumbed down and passive that they don't even want to challenge this stuff in court for the most part. We don't have any politicians, even the Republican Party, even though the vast majority of Republicans believe it's a lie. We don't have Republican politicians who are doing anything to challenge this. So a lot of lawsuits about this, ranging from remain in their homes, to lawsuits about mandating that people avoid public places. They said this is a fundamental right of personal freedom. This is in Germany, not in America. Meanwhile, German courts have been ruling against the restrictions, not American courts. In one case, well, we've had a few victories. We've had some court cases involving churches being able to meet. But other than that, I can't think of any victories offhand that we've had. And that's been a mixed bag. In some courts, they said, well, you can open up a casino, but you can't open up a church in the same town. In one case, a court granted interim relief after plaintiffs say the city illegally prohibited a protest despite detailed social distancing precautions outlined by organizers. The court said the city's ban violated the freedom of assembly and that legal challenges instituted in March do not apply to open-air assemblies. In a second case, regarding a protest in Stuttgart, the city was found to be in violation. A constitutional court said that the city violated, again, the freedom of assembly. And in a third case, Muslims petitioning to hold prayers at a mosque, because, the Christians in Germany, just like here, even worse than here, they don't care to sue to have church service. So the Muslims do. They wanted to hold prayers at a mosque during Ramadan, and so they were suing Lower Saxony's strict ban on religious gatherings. That was overturned by the High Administrative Court. Although they did refuse, they overturned the ban by Stuttgart, but they did refuse to open all masks, and they noted that the infection risk depended on several details, and that a blanket becomes a blanket, and vice versa, right? That's the kind of stuff you're going to get out of courts. They called their lockdown thing, they called it the Infection Protection Act. This is like Tower Power's soul vaccination. You got to get the protection, you got to get the infection protection. This is the stuff of satire, of dystopian satire. It's the stuff of Terry Gilliam's 1984, quite frankly. And the way that we've been lied to by these different organizations, just unbelievable. The Biden team is now telling everybody no COVID herd immunity until Thanksgiving. Let me tell you, never. They're never going to back off. They're never going to remove any of these regulations. They're going to add more masks. They're going to add more vaccines. They're going to add more of everything. These people are drunk with power. I said before, they're going to start mandating, if we're lucky, the Biden administration will try to mandate this. We've got to have something to wake up the general population. I don't know if that'll do it or not. But that's, to me, that's the only hope I see, is that they continue to boil the frogs slowly. And that's what Abbott is trying to do here. All right, we're not going to lock down the churches. That would make them too angry. So we'll let them meet in churches, but we'll have them wear masks everywhere else. They want to boil you slowly. If they step this up,
elections were held in Iraq.
And guess who got 100%? That's maybe the only way we're going to get the masses to coalesce against this. But look, your freedom is not based. It's about is a priest, a Catholic priest who he's running from the Nazis, and he goes to the Czech Republic, Czech area, and the Soviets are there, and he understands what the Soviets are about as well. He knows that after the war is over, if the Soviets are running that area, that they're going to come after the Christians. And so he starts organizing people in underground cells. That's where you need to be right now. But the key thing that he told them was, the only way you're going to withstand this is with your Christian faith. That's the only thing that matters. And it doesn't really matter what they do to you. They can destroy your body, but they can't destroy your soul. They cannot imprison your mind if it's been freed by Christ. And so that's really where your hope is. Your hope is not in convincing people. I don't do this to persuade people. I do talk about how you ought to try to persuade people. But I'm trying to talk to the Christians who need to prepare themselves for what's coming. You need to prepare for the worst case. And you need to understand the times that we live in. And it is not something that you don't have to have success in politics to make your life meaningful. You know, Hillary Clinton needed success in politics to make her life meaningful. She talked about there is no meaning in politics. There is no success in controlling other people's lives. We will never be satisfied. People who seek power and money always want more power and money. Just like John D. Rockefeller said when the reporter asked him, how much is enough money to the richest man in the world at the time? And he said, always a little bit more. They're never satisfied. Look at Jeff Bezos, for example. The Biden administration is now bowing to the teachers union, and they're saying the goal should be to reopen just one school the school should open 1 day per week. So we're talking about a 1 day school week. And before the students start cheering, what that means is that you're going to be stuck on your Zoom classes for 4 days a week, right? It's the teachers unions who don't want to go back to school. And you got As a matter of fact, his press secretary and his chief of staff were pushing back on these issues, even though think about this, how powerful the CD19 transmission amongst students and teachers was not an issue. We're going to side with the teachers union, and so did his press. And then finally, this in terms of the vaccine. Sarah Jablow has sought a hard-to-find combination of personality traits in prospective boyfriends. Now, however, after nearly a year of the COVID-19 pandemic, one elusive characteristic is beginning to transcend all others for her: vaccination status. So this makes your job easier if you're looking for a wife or a husband. You can rule out the people who have a criteria of vaccination status. It also helps you to identify the social justice warriors out there with their mask over their faces, like, okay, we can save a little bit of time here. We don't actually have to go through dates. And she's a 34-year-old winemaker from Napa, California. She says about a half dozen Zoom dates. And she's been on a couple of real-life dates since she ended her long-term, who is either vaccinated or interested in getting a vaccine soon. Looking at Travis here, it's like, yeah, she's looking for somebody who is equally yoked to the CDC and Fauci.
Must be as brainwashed.
That's right. Travis says must be as brainwashed as him. As a matter of fact, to find level-headed girls out there. One of the guys back read this to the boys there, and he said, they remember Treebeard? You know, it's like, all the wives, they've gone away. I can't find any wives, and that's basically, you got a level-headed Christian. She said, I'm pretty straightforward about it. I believe in science. And if someone isn't interested in the vaccine, or they don't believe in vaccines in general, I'm done. Well, good. Save you a lot of time. You know, you could waste a lot of time on getting to know somebody like this before you figure out what she's really about. So now that's right up front. Getting vaccinated or being open to getting it is now, says WTOP, the hottest. It's the hottest thing you can do. This is they've taken the vaccine while they're wearing the mask still. Your health and safety to be in the open to get the vaccine, but it's good for your dating life as well. There you go. So, you know, I guess it's really hot. It's kind of like, you know, the mask and stuff, it's kind of like this S&M thing. And it is sadomasochistic, really. It is. It's very sick. The whole thing is very sick. So, yeah. I'm looking for a single white female who is wearing a mask, modifying vaccines. That's what I'm looking for in a spouse. One of the articles that was sent to me when I started talking about Jeremy Corbyn was a quote from Corbyn, and he said, one thing science doesn't do is settled opinions. And for another thing, they're all wrong. when he was talking about climate change. And I've said that all along. I said real science is never settled. Right? Science is based on skepticism, and you have a scientific method. And one of the reasons that Francis Bacon, who was a Christian, by the way, strong Christian, just like Isaac Newton, Bacon said that you have to reject the argument from authority. No, let's not do that. Let's have a scientific method. And so a scientific method is going to be where you go out and you have a hypothesis. You're able to test that with measurements and so forth. You're able to repeat it and to prove it. And you should be skeptical enough that you want to prove this. And when they sent this to me, they sent me an article where a British newspaper was attacking Piers Corbyn because of, and it's a picture of him at a demonstration. I don't think this is the one where the street preacher was bullhorning, because Corbyn's got the bullhorn there. But they said, let's just take a look at some of the things that he had to say. And let's do that real quickly. Number one, coronavirus is not as deadly as the flu. Well, he said, we take a look at the death reports here, and he said, we see that that's not the case. And I just read that to you, and that's the data we now have from the CDC. And so the paper comes back and said, is he right? Well, the experts say he's not. See, argument from authority. And who is the expert? Professor Neil Ferguson of the Imperial College of London, who didn't know how you model a epidemic with Farr's law going back to 1840, the bell-shaped curve. That's where that comes from. He didn't have that in his model. He didn't have a computer model that could get the same answer twice with the same input. But he is the expert, they said. He is an expert epidemiologist and infectious disease modeler. What a joke these people are. Professor Ferguson says, let me be clear. This virus has a lethality substantially in excess of the seasonal flu. Well, no, it doesn't. Seasonal flu has disappeared. It's been renamed. Piers Corbyn says this is not a pandemic. It's not a pandemic in Britain, in America, anywhere in the world. They said, is he right? Well, no, because we have authorities who say that he's not right. Look, if you can meet, as John MacArthur has been doing since July, every week, 7,000 to 8,000 people, no masks, no anti-social distancing, and horror of horrors, they're singing, and nobody gets sick, there is no epidemic in that community. Well, you have to have an epidemic, and 7,000 or 8,000 people, that's the size of a good city, isn't it? Small city. And if you can have a city where nobody is obeying the law from Fauci, the rules from Fauci, and nothing is happening to them, and you don't have an epidemic there, then you don't have a pandemic, because a pandemic is an epidemic everywhere. Everywhere. They go on it, they say, Piers Corbyn says the lockdown is costing more lives than it is saving. He said people are dying in care homes. People are dying at home because they don't have access to hospitals. We're here on a necessary mission, a necessary activity to save lives. The sooner the lockdown is ended, the sooner lives will be saved. The government has us all locked down. They say it's to save lives, but it's wrong. It's now costing more lives than it saves. And on that level that they want under a new world order. And so then the paper says, is he right? If this is a conspiracy to take over the world, it's a strangely helpful one, because Corbyn claimed in his address that the government was using the coronavirus lockdown as a cover to destroy small business, but the government is handing out grants to small business. See, they want you to survive. They're going to give you a little tiny communist stimulus there. So yeah, there's nothing sinister. Jump the shark. I don't see any evidence. Exactly what's in it. A lot of people have been concerned about a lot of these different additives and how they might be used, how they might be triggered. But to literally say it's microchips, there's no evidence of that. So we have to be careful of that. And so, I agree with him on most of what he had to say, but we have to be careful with it. He says this is not freedom, it's the opposite of freedom, and that's exactly true. If you force people by coercion to consent to this, then that is not freedom. All right, let's take a quick look at the Trump trial. And before we do, real quickly, let me just remind you again that you can find all the links to where the live streams are, the video archives on BitChute and YouTube, where you can find our podcasts on Podbean, iTunes, and it's good to get the links because remember there was an iTunes, I've had a podcast that was up, David Knight Show podcast, and we've not been able to get that turned over to us. And so we had to come up with a different name. So it's the real David Knight Show. If you actually go to some of these podcast places and look for it. So we've got the direct link there to iTunes and to Stitcher and to Spotify and other places like that. So we have the actual link there in case you're looking for it. There is, most of these places will be another podcast that is there that has not been updated since I was fired by Alex. So if you want to know where that is, you can go to thedavidknightshow.com, and you can also find links there as to how you can support us financially. And we'll be getting a budget meter there at that website. We'll put it up some other places too, but that'd be the logical place for us to put it up. A lot of people say we'd like to know how you're doing, and so we'll show you how that is set up, and we'll also put that up for the people who support us on Subscribestar. Make one-time contributions there. You can also make contributions via PayPal, and you can do it with a direct link on PayPal or send it to the email. The email is davidknightshow@protonmail.com. And if you'd like to send us letters and correspondence and encouragement, we really do like that. We'd like to know if you're praying for us. davidknightshow.com. So the live broadcast, the video archives, the podcasts, the links to financial support, thedavidknightshow.com. Let's talk about the Trump trial. Trump trial 2, day 1. Trump trial 2.1, impeachment 2.1. The most amazing thing, and I had to go to the dentist yesterday, so I was in the waiting room a little bit, and we've had that battle, so I don't have to wear a mask anymore. To go see the dentist, because you can't see a dentist with a mask on your face, right? And so anyway, I mean, they're all masked up and they're behind plexiglass, all this other kind of stuff, and they're wearing face masks and face shields, all this other kind of stuff. And I said, really? Doing all this stuff, and they don't. But while I was sitting there in the waiting room, I'm watching what was on television being broadcast, and I thought, who is this guy? Is this some senator that I haven't seen before? Because it didn't dawn on me that he was a lawyer, because he was just rambling all over the place. And it's like, this guy sounds like a senator, but I don't recognize this guy. It turns out that it was one of Trump's lawyers. And got out of the dentist's office, and I looked at what's going on with the news. You got Alan Dershowitz, you got Jonathan Turley, and they're saying, what's this guy doing? Nobody can believe what he's doing, whether they're a supporter of Trump or an opponent of Trump. They can't believe this lawyer, Bruce Castor. Dershowitz, who was on the former impeachment defense team, when he was talking about Bruce Castor, he says, I have no idea what he's doing. He says, maybe he'll bring it home. But right now, it doesn't appear to me to be an effective advocacy. He may know the senators better than I do. Maybe they want to be buttered up. Maybe they want to be told what great people they are. And maybe they want to be told that he knows 2 senators. But it's not the kind of argument that I would have made. I have to tell you that. And, again, as I said yesterday, It pains me to agree with Alan Dershowitz because I find him to be a thoroughly reprehensible individual. Thoroughly reprehensible. But he is clever. Yeah, he's a good lawyer. And he certainly knows what he's talking about. I mean, he talked for many years, for example, there at Harvard. He goes on to say, his argument is, you cannot abridge the freedom of speech. And whatever you think of the president's speech, I don't think very much of it, he said, but it can't be the basis of impeachment if it's constitutionally protected. And so he's right about that. Whether you agree or not with what President Trump was saying about the election or any of this other stuff or what he was asking people to do, to put pressure on them, it was not something that he could be punished for under the First Amendment. The lawyers who signed on to lead Trump's impeachment defense team bring a curious history of experience. David Shun, a seasoned civil and criminal lawyer, and then this guy, Bruce Castor. I think there's three of them. But in this particular one, this is from CNN. They're only mentioning the two of them. Castor is a well-known lawyer, they said. He is a former county district attorney, and then he served 2 terms as a county commissioner. Think about this. Trump has got a guy who was a county district attorney and then a county commissioner. And even as a county district attorney, he didn't have a very good record. When he was a county district attorney, the Bill Cosby situation came up in his location. That was back in 2005. And he declined to prosecute Bill Cosby, reported that the actor had touched her inappropriately at his home in that county where this guy was a district attorney. And he cited, quote, insufficient, credible, and admissible evidence, unquote. Bill Cosby was later tried and convicted in 2018, 13 years later, for drugging and sexually assaulting her in his home in 2004, despite the fact that Castor argued during a pretrial hearing that he had already committed the state to not prosecuting the actor. So what's going on with this guy? The other lawyer, David Shun, I guess is the way he pronounced his name, was on the team of lawyers representing Roger Stone, except that he didn't actually represent Roger Stone. He was going to represent Roger Stone in the appeal, but that wasn't heard. He's just a mastermind. He's playing 4D chess. You know, trust him. He's a man with a plan. He is doing Sun Tzu's Art of War. He's got a sting, said Steve Pachinik. No, when I look at this defense team, what I see is what I've seen in his cabinet, his administration, all the people that he surrounded himself by, blithering incompetence. I mean, for the most part, he's had very few people who had any competence in his administration for the last 4 years. It's been a clown show, just like this thing yesterday was. And he's had the people who are competent are people who adamantly oppose everything that he told his voters he was for, right? Oh, he's had some competent people in, and they have been establishment swamp critters that he's put in his administration. They were very competent. But the other people who seemed to agree with him on the agenda were just as competent as this lawyer yesterday, Castor. And, you know, when you, I know that, that people want to believe that he is a 4D chess master. And that, you know, Trump only looks stupid and that, you know, he's not really incapable of picking anybody to help him in any of this. It's all just, you know, maneuvering around to make it look like he's helpless, right? When in reality, he's got an underground sting going. He's got a plan, and he's going to round up all these international pedophiles all at once. You know, he's not really as stupid as he seems on the surface, right? It's, you know, Flynn and McInerney are going to swoop out with 20,000 National Guard troops, and they're going to arrest all the Democrats. I'll have to do better next time. I didn't even catch any of his. after several Republican senators criticized his presentation by him and by the other lawyer, one of them calling it disorganized, some of them instead praising the case made by the Democrat impeachment managers. Shun said he thought the House managers, quote, did a good job. He congratulated the other side, and he said, I have to do better. Then you've got the Cassidy guy. Senator Cassidy was one of the 6 Republican senators who voted Monday to deem the impeachment trial constitutional. Now, that's one more. I don't know if Cassidy was with the group before, because remember, Rand Paul held a vote and said, is this even constitutional? And it was 55-45. Of presentation. But it's still a moot case, right? Because they still don't have, they have to have 2/3 of the Republic, not a simple majority, but 2/3 to impeach. And we'll talk about what the actual substance of what they had to say and the substance of what the Democrats had to say here. But before we do, let's just talk about how breathtakingly incompetent it was, like the last 4 years of the Trump administration. And the most charitable view of this. If you think that President Trump really wanted to do the things that he had to say, you have to say it's just breathtakingly incompetent. And that was where I was for the first 3 years of the Trump administration. And then when he did the lockdown executive order, when he pushed Operation Warp Speed, when he refused to have the political conventions, when he refused to stop the lockdown and stop Fauci, and it was baked in that he was going to lose. And I said, well, before the election, I said, the purpose of this is to further divide the country, to push us into some kind of a civil war, an election that at least half of the country is not going to believe. And then to push for something like you've got Flynn and McInerney pushing for. And so for the last year, I haven't believed that Trump is just incompetent and stupid and incapable of doing anything other than tweeting. For the last year, I believe it's been a lot more sinister than that. Lindsey Graham conceded Texas, said, rambled on and on and on and didn't really address the constitutional argument. I've seen a lot of lawyers and a lot of arguments, and that was, he pauses, not one of the finest I've ever seen. Yeah, pretty bad. So 6 Republicans are now breaking ranks instead of 5 previously. But as Jonathan Turley points out, there is still not really any point of moving on. It's a dead letter. They're not going to get a conviction if you've got these Republicans saying that it's not constitutional. Why do they say it's not constitutional? Well, there was a little bit of a discussion of the legal issues by Trump's lawyers. Jonathan Turley said, Castor is now making a Rule 23 argument on the indivisibility of the article to highlight the 14th Amendment claim. And he says, I'm surprised at the long discussion in the Senate before getting to such concrete arguments. And that's what everybody's saying. He's just droning on and on. Get to the point. What is the point? And he says, so they finally did get to the point that there is, he said, there's also, when he tweeted this out, he said, there's also no focus on the fact that this is a retroactive trial issue. In other words, he's already out of office. The purpose of impeachment is to remove somebody from office, and he's out of office. It's a dead letter. It's a moot point, frankly. But that's not really the point, right? They're after something else. The Democrats are after something else, far more dangerous. We'll talk about that in a second. He went on to say, more heat than light from the defense so far. The team needs to focus on the constitutional claims and focus on history. Got David Shun tearing into the Democrats when the Senate needs to hear an argument about the constitutional issues. The defense has eaten roughly half of its time without landing a glove on the constitutional questions. Shun was said to be the one who would present an erudite analysis of the constitutional issue. But he didn't. And as Alan Dershowitz said, there is no argument. I have no idea what the man is doing. So what were the Democrats doing? Well, you had their lead manager, Congressman Jamie Raskin. He began the day by playing a clip of Trump encouraging his supporters to show up at the Capitol, but he left out the part where Trump told them to conduct themselves, quote, patriotically and peacefully, unquote. So they put up an edited quote. So they pull out the most inflammatory political rhetoric that they can find, and then they immediately show violence, right? And they don't show him saying, do this patriotically and peacefully. Raskin showed a montage after the rhetoric that was, the strong rhetoric. He shows a montage of the storming and took stuff from the BLM activist who is, he's going to be honored as a reporter. At one point, Jeremy Raskin, the guy who is essentially the prosecutor from the House, invoked his dead son who committed suicide days before the insurrection. See, it was a very emotional appeal. Let's show pictures of violent clips. Let's edit the speech to make it sound as provocative as possible. And then let me talk about my son who committed suicide days before the insurrection. It is totally unrelated, really. Totally unrelated, but it is relatable. See, and this is the point. These guys that were on the Trump team were talking to the senators, and they were playing, the one, David Shun, was kind of playing the political card. Well, the senator's not going to be impressed by that. I mean, they know who these guys are. For the most part, they're friends with them in clubs. They pretend to be enemies, but it's like professional wrestling. Or it's like the old Warner Brothers cartoon where you had the wolf and the sheepdog. Beginning of the day, they go and they punch the clock. And, hey, how you doing, Ralph? Oh, I'm doing pretty good. And then they're after each other the rest of the day. And they finish up and then they go punch the card and they shake hands and go get a beer. That's the way politics is, right? The wolf and the sheepdog. But so to talk to them about how, just to ramble on about things and to talk about how bad the Democrats are, that isn't doing anything. But what are the Democrats doing? They're not talking to the senators, they're talking to the American people for the most part. But they're also putting out this fear campaign, this fear of violence. They're keeping D.C. locked down with troops and concertina wire, and they're showing pictures. They want a domestic terrorist. An authoritarian expansion of government power. And so they're going to show visual, visceral clips. They're going to get emotional. They're going to show reporters with violent footage. We're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. We're going to go to the Capitol. We're going to try to give our Republicans, the weak ones, we're going to try to give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country, says Trump in the video. And then the video follows. Disrupt the vote count. So it's playing to the fear. I mean, this is basically what the squad has been doing for the last few days. The vast majority of people that were there, and even the people who were close to the Capitol, even some of the people who went into the Capitol, said, we were told that we could come in. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to go in there. We're just standing there. Dr. Simone Gold, she does a bullhorn, gave her speech there with a bullhorn that she'd given a couple of days ago about the pandemic. She didn't force her way in. She didn't threaten anybody physically. She was there to talk. The video then shows the text of a tweet that Trump sent 4 hours earlier and said, these are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who've been badly and unfairly treated for so long. And then End of the video, they put up text. Ashley Babbitt. We'll talk about that in a second. Your business or your liberty or your ability to travel or to do anything that you want. Michael Isikoff. He said, we're more than five here, and the senators are is an aside. It's always my senator. The people who you represent are proud of you, you senators. And you like that. United States senators have a reputation of being cool-headed, being erudite. Oh, really? Okay. This is like one of those Father of the Bride speeches that won't ever end, and the bride is trying to keep a smile, and everybody is trying to finish their drinks. It's like, I don't know. Abby Phillips said, I called on, and so they just stand up and riff for 15 minutes. In other words, this guy, Trump's defense lawyer, sounds like somebody who hasn't done his work, hasn't read the assignment, and he's just ad-libbing. Bruce Castor is now saying water, ice, water, ice, water, ice, over and over. Wow, said John Hodgman. And then finally this, the cat lawyer would have done a better job than Bruce Castor. And of course, that's the hilarious cat. Trump's dubious First Amendment defense against impeachment, says Reason. Now, they don't disagree that it is that they can't get him for what he has to say, but they have quite a different spin on it, which I think is kind of interesting. He needs to talk about history. Trump's lawyers concede the majority of the House thought the